She built his empire with her bare hands, and he handed it to someone else. 5 years. Every sleepless negotiation, every alliance sealed in her name, every enemy she smiled at so he wouldn't have to. Selene Vaelor gave Draven Merrick everything a Luna could give a rising Alpha Lord. And on the night his banners flew highest, he looked across a crowded hall, saw Seraphine Dorn standing in gold silk and old money, and made his choice without blinking. Not with anger, not with guilt, with preference. Stay until the end. You're going to want to see how she rises. Drop your city in the comments. This story belongs to all of us. The morning the summons arrived, Selene was elbow deep in a sink full of cold water, scrubbing river clay off a set of copper bowls she'd found 3 weeks earlier at a market stall in the Ravengate Lower District. The vendor had called them antiques. She'd called them 50 silvers too expensive and bought them anyway because they caught the light a certain way that reminded her of nothing she could name, which meant they reminded her of nothing she was trying to forget. That was the rule she'd built her new life on. If something reminded her of Velmora's upper court, she didn't bring it through the door. The summons was rolled inside a black cylinder stamped with the Merrick family seal, a wolf's head wearing a crown of thorns, rendered in pressed gold wax. It had been slid under her door sometime before dawn, which meant whoever delivered it didn't knock, which meant they knew she would have refused it at the threshold. She dried her hands on a rough cloth and stood in the center of her one-room flat for a long time before she picked it up. Ravengate was a city for people who needed to disappear without quite vanishing. Former soldiers who still woke screaming. Merchants who'd lost everything to bad contracts and worse luck. Women who'd left situations that polite society preferred not to discuss. Selene had found it 4 months after the dissolution ceremony, when her pride finally ran out of places to carry her, and she'd landed here the way water lands at the bottom of a cliff. Not by choice exactly, but by the exhaustion of everywhere else. She'd found work fast. Her hands knew logistics. Her mind knew negotiation. The trading company that hired her on as a route coordinator didn't ask why a woman with the bearing of a court Luna was working schedules and inventory manifests in a drafty office above a tannery. They just handed her a stack of ledgers and told her the Northfall route was 6 days behind, and if she could fix it, she could keep the job. She fixed it in 2. Nobody in Ravengate knew who she was. That was the other rule, and it had held cleanly and completely right up until the moment she peeled the seal off the cylinder and unrolled the summons inside. The handwriting was Draven's personal secretary. She recognized the tight rightward slant of it. Aldrich, who had worked for the Merrick house for 20 years and who had once told Selene, with genuine warmth, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to their lord's political future. She wondered if Aldrich felt any discomfort writing this particular letter. She decided probably not. Aldrich's loyalty was to the house, not to the people in it. The summons was formal, courteous, almost gentle in its phrasing, which was somehow the worst part. It requested her presence at the mating ceremony of Alpha Lord Draven Merrick and Lady Seraphine Dorne, to be held in 14 days at Black Hollow Palace. It noted that her attendance would honor the sanctity of the former bond and demonstrate the strength of character befitting a Luna of her standing. It used the phrase former bond, her standing, as if she still had one. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table, went back to the sink, and finished washing the copper bowls. She worked methodically, scrubbing the same bowl 4 times without realizing it, her hands moving on their own while something behind her sternum went very quiet and very cold. By the time she was done, she knew 2 things with absolute certainty. She was not going to collapse over this, and she was not going to stay silent either. She'd been silent long enough. That was the part nobody saw from the outside. Not the humiliation of the dissolution ceremony. Not the moment Draven had reached for Seraphine's hand in the moon court, while Selene stood 3 feet away still wearing the Luna's silver. The silence had started earlier than that. It had started in the small moments, the ones she'd rationalized away one at a time until rationalization became a full-time occupation. Draven missing dinners they'd planned. Draven ending conversations when certain names came up. Draven looking at her in that particular way. Not with love exactly, not with contempt either, but with a kind of careful neutrality. The way you look at a fire you're not sure you want to sit beside anymore. She had told herself it was stress. The expansion negotiations with the Eastern Territories. The pressure from the Noble Council. She had told herself she was being insecure, and that insecurity was not befitting of a Luna, and that if she just continued to be useful and steady and present, the warmth would come back. This was the thing about loving someone who was slowly leaving. You spent so much energy explaining away their absence that by the time they were finally, formally gone, you were already exhausted. The betrayal itself almost came as a relief, because at least it was honest. At least it was real. What Draven had given her in those final months was something worse than cruelty. He had given her ambiguity. He had given her a version of love that she had to squint to see, hold at arm's length, and tilt toward the light, always wondering if the shape she was seeing was what she thought it was, or just what she needed it to be. And then Seraphine arrived, and the squinting stopped, and Selene saw everything in brutal, merciless clarity. She stood at her window the evening after the summons arrived and looked down at the lamplit street below. A fishmonger hauling his empty cart home, two old women arguing over something Selene couldn't hear, a boy chasing a dog that had something it shouldn't, and she thought about what it meant to be asked to attend the ceremony. It wasn't an honor, she knew that. It was a performance. Draven needed her there because her absence would read as devastation, and her presence, if managed correctly, would read as magnanimity, proof that the Merrick dissolution had been civilized, reasonable, even kind. Her attendance would be the final courtesy she offered his reputation. She was done offering, but refusing quietly, staying here in Ravengate and simply not appearing. That was also a performance, just a different one. The performance of someone too wounded to show up. The performance of a woman defined by what had been done to her. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and breathed until the cold entered her and the heat behind her eyes receded. There had to be a third option. She found it at the bottom of a cup of black coffee, 2 hours past midnight, sitting at the table with the summons spread open in front of her, and 3 months of accumulated silence finally reaching its capacity. King Caedric Thorne. The name surfaced the way dangerous ideas always do. Not announced, not reasoned toward, just suddenly present, already fully formed, already slightly terrifying. She knew what she knew about Caedric Thorne the same way everyone in the Empire knew it, through accumulated reports, treaty documents she'd handled during her years managing Draven's political correspondence, and the particular kind of silence that fell in rooms when his name came up. He ruled the northern empire of Ashenvale from a palace called the Greyhold, a fortress carved into the side of a mountain range so severe that the cartographers had simply drawn a line past it and written, "Here the roads end." He had consolidated 3 fractured northern kingdoms into one unified empire in 7 years, which every military historian agreed was either brilliant or catastrophic, and most agreed was both. He had ended 2 dynastic bloodlines that had stood for a century, not through massacre, but through political dismantlement, so methodical and complete that the families were left technically alive and utterly powerless, which most people who'd studied the matter agreed was more permanent than killing them. He had not taken a mate. He had not sought allies through marriage. He had, as far as anyone in the southern courts could determine, no obvious weaknesses. The rumor that he possessed no heart left to wound had started somewhere in the middle of his second military campaign and had never really been refuted. Selene thought about this for a long time. Then she thought about what she actually needed. She did not need someone sentimental. She did not need someone who would be moved by her situation. She did not need comfort or rescue or even particularly much sympathy. She needed someone whose presence, beside her, at Draven's mating ceremony, would make the entire court forget to feel sorry for her. She needed someone who would shift the entire gravity of the room. Caedric Thorne could do that by walking through a door. The question was what she could possibly offer a man who had everything he'd taken by force and wanted nothing he hadn't already earned. She sat with that question until the coffee went cold and the lamplighter made his second pass down the street outside. And then she wrote the letter herself, in her own hand, because she'd already decided that if she was going to do something unprecedented, she was going to do it with the nerve it deserved. She had to travel to get it to him. She had no court channels, no official seals, no diplomatic infrastructure. She had a horse she'd been boarding at the Ravengate stables, a set of travel clothes that were functional without being fashionable, and a letter she'd rewritten 4 times before deciding the 4th version was the worst one and sending the first. The letter said, "I am Selene Vaelor, former Luna of the Merrick House. I am seeking an escort to a ceremony I have been summoned to attend. I understand your time has value. I cannot match in currency. I am offering something else. If this interests you enough to hear it in person, I will be at the Ashen Vale border town of Grimset in 6 days. I will wait 2 days. If you do not come, I will understand the answer without requiring it stated. She did not explain what she was offering. She had decided this while writing the first version and scratching it out. If she explained it in writing, he could refuse it in writing, and a written refusal from Caedric Thorne would feel very much like a door closing. If she explained it in person, at least she'd be in the room. At least the door would be open when she pushed. The border town of Grimset was 4 days' ride. She left before dawn the morning after writing the letter, and she rode with the particular focus of someone who is very carefully not thinking about everything that could go wrong. Grimset was the last real town before the mountain passes that led north into Ashen Vale's territories, which meant it was the kind of town that had learned to exist at the edge of 2 different worlds without belonging to either. The people there moved like people who'd seen enough not to be surprised by much. The inn she stayed at had walls thick enough to block the mountain wind, and a proprietor who asked no questions, which she paid extra to ensure continued. She waited. On the morning of the second day, she woke to the sound of horses in the courtyard. Too many for a merchant company, too quiet for a military detachment, moving with the disciplined economy of trained riders who went fast by default. She dressed in under a minute, old instinct resurging without her consciously calling on it, and was at the window before the last of the riders had cleared the inn's archway. There were 12 of them. Northern mountain horses, built deep through the chest. The riders wore dark wool and worked leather with no insignia visible, which told her more than insignia would have. Nobody without extreme confidence strips away their markings. The man at the center of the formation was the last to dismount. She had a brief, singular impression before she turned from the window to go downstairs. Tall, harder looking than she'd expected, even with everything she'd read. The kind of stillness that wasn't calm, but rather the opposite of calm, fully mastered. She took 3 deliberate breaths on the stairs and walked into the common room like she owned it. Oh, I was already seated when she came down, which meant he'd moved through the inn quickly and without apparent interest in announcing himself. His riders had taken the edges of the room in a loose perimeter that looked casual and was almost certainly not. The proprietor was noticeably absent. Caedric Thorne looked up when she crossed the room. His eyes were the color of deep water over stone. Gray with no warmth and no coldness either, just a clarity that was somehow more unsettling than either. He had a scar that ran from his left jaw to the edge of his cheekbone, old enough to have settled into something almost architectural. He looked at her with the complete, unhurried attention of a man who had decided some time ago that his time was only worth spending on things that merited the full weight of it. She sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. "You made good time," she said. "Your letter was interesting." "Which part?" "The part where you said you were offering something without saying what." "If I'd said what, you'd have answered in writing." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement that a point had been made. "You've done negotiation work. 5 years of it. For Merrick." "Yes." He studied her for a moment. She held it without looking away, which required more effort than she intended because something about the way he looked at people suggested he was not merely observing but measuring, and she had the distinct sense the measurement was thorough. "Tell me what you want," he said. "An escort to the Merrick Dorn mating ceremony at Black Hollow Palace. 14 days from now. 10 now. Your presence beside me." "I know what an escort is." "Then you know what it would mean." "I know what it would look like," he said. "That isn't the same thing. What do you actually want from this, Selene Vaelor?" She had prepared for this question. She had an answer ready. Something about political optics. Something about refusing to be defined by the dissolution. Something strategic and measured and reasonable. She had that answer fully constructed and available, and she did not use it. "I want them to see that I survived," she said. Silence. One of his riders shifted slightly near the far wall. Caedric didn't move. "Survived," he repeated. "Intact, standing, not broken, not performing grief for an audience that wants to watch me perform it." She kept her voice level. "He expected me to either refuse the summons, which would look like devastation, or attend alone, which would look like I was still asking his permission to exist near him. I am not interested in either version of that story." Caedric was quiet for a long time. The morning light came through the narrow inn windows and laid itself across the table between them, and she noticed that he had large hands, scarred across the knuckles, and that he held his coffee cup with the same careful stillness. He seemed to hold everything. You're not asking for revenge, he said. It wasn't a question. No. Most people in your situation would be. Most people in my situation haven't thought it through, she said. Revenge requires him to matter enough to direct energy toward. I'm not there. I want something cleaner than that. He looked at her with something new in the gray clarity of his gaze. Not warmth, exactly, but attention of a different quality. What are you offering? He said. This was the part she had spent the most time on. She straightened in her chair. Information. I spent 5 years inside Merrick's political infrastructure. Every treaty he negotiated, every alliance he made, every position he took on Southern Empire matters, from Velmora to the coast. I know who his real allies are versus his public ones. I know where his agreements have vulnerabilities. For a Northern Empire ruler with interests in Southern expansion, that's not a small thing. No, he said. It isn't. I'm not asking for ongoing intelligence work. I'm asking for 10 days of your time and your presence at one event. In exchange, I give you everything I know about Draven Merrick's political architecture. She paused. And I know quite a lot. He turned the coffee cup once in his scarred hands. You're trading on your own past to fund your future. I'm using what I have. That's either resourceful or desperate. It's both, she said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But the information is real and the offer is straight. And I think you know both of those things, or you wouldn't have ridden 4 days to hear it. Another silence. Longer. Then he set the cup down. I'll have my people verify what you've told me. If it confirms to the level you're suggesting, I'll escort you to Black Hollow. And if it doesn't confirm, then you'll have had an honest answer, he said, which is more than most people get from me. She nodded once. That's fair. He stood. She stood. The geometry of him was striking up close, not just the height, but the quality of the space he occupied, as if he was slightly more solid than regular matter. One condition, he said. Name it. While we travel, you don't perform for me. No court manner, no diplomatic padding. If you're afraid, say so. If you're angry, say so. I have enough people around me pretending everything is manageable. He held her gaze. Can you do that? She thought about 5 years of careful management. 5 years of calibrating herself to what a room needed from her, what Draven needed, what the court needed. Yes, she said, and meant it in a way she hadn't meant anything in quite some time. His people verified in 2 days. She'd expected it might take 4 and had prepared herself for the waiting, but Caedric's intelligence network moved with an efficiency that was quietly staggering, and when his senior advisor, a lean, watchful man named Corvin, who looked like he had been born skeptical and spent his life refining the skill, delivered his report, the result was evidently sufficient. Caedric told her in 3 words. We leave tomorrow. The journey south took 6 days. She rode beside him for most of it, which was not the position she'd expected. She'd expected to be placed somewhere in the formation's middle, guest adjacent, but not central. Instead, he rode with her at his left on the first morning and didn't adjust this on the second, and by the third she'd stopped noticing it as an arrangement and started noticing it as a fact. He was not warm. She hadn't expected warm. But he was present in a way that was almost aggressive in its completeness. He listened when she spoke without the particular distraction most powerful people carried, the constant background hum of their own importance. And when he responded, he meant the words he used, which she found herself calibrating to quickly, the way you calibrate to a new altitude. On the 3rd day, she asked him why he'd actually come to Grimset. They were riding through the lower reaches of the mountain passes, where the scrub pine thinned and the terrain opened into something less brutal. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Your letter, he said finally. I know. What about it? You didn't explain yourself. People who feel the need to explain themselves extensively are either lying or afraid. And people who don't are usually both, but have made peace with it. She rode with that for a while. Which am I? Still determining. On the 4th day, she told him the outline of what had happened, not the way she'd told it in her own head, which was still tangled with self-interrogation and the exhausting forensic work of trying to pinpoint exactly when things had shifted. But plainly, in sequence, the way she'd describe any situation to someone who needed the facts in order to understand the current problem. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, The slow withdrawal is worse than abrupt betrayal. She looked at him. You sound like someone who knows. I know what it costs to be uncertain about something you should be certain of, he said. Uncertainty is the most expensive thing you can carry. It takes more energy than grief. She thought about that for the rest of the day. On the fifth day, Corvin rode up beside her while Caedric was speaking with one of the other riders and said, without preamble, "He hasn't escorted anyone anywhere in 4 years." She kept her eyes forward. "I'm aware it's unusual." "Unusual is a word for it." Corvin's voice was dry. "I want you to understand what his presence at this ceremony is going to mean to people." "Leverage," she said. "The room will restructure itself around him the moment he walks in. Every calculation every person in that hall has made about you will have to be remade." He paused. "That's what you wanted?" "Yes." "Then be ready for what comes after wanting it," he said. "Because the people who have the most to lose from that restructuring will be looking for ways to complicate your situation." She looked at him then. He had a face that had clearly been interesting once and had been weathered into something more functional than interesting. She understood immediately why Caedric valued him. "Noted," she said. "Also," Corvin said, and something shifted slightly in his expression. "For what it's worth, I reviewed your work on the Northfall route corridors from your Merrick period. The efficiency gains you negotiated were not small." She blinked. "You researched more than the political intelligence." "We research everything," he said, and rode back to his position. They reached the outer territories of Velmora on the 6th day, and the landscape changed from the spare, unconditional north into something greener and more managed. Cultivated fields, maintained roads, the particular tidiness of land that knew it was being watched. Selene felt it in her chest the moment they crossed the territorial marker. A tightening, not quite dread, more like the body remembering things the mind had worked hard to file away. She hadn't been back. Not once in the months since Ravengate. She hadn't realized how much effort had been going into that particular absence until the absence ended, and she felt the cost of it in her sternum. Caedric said nothing. He simply moved his horse a half step closer to hers, not touching, not making a thing of it, just present. She was grateful in a way she didn't say anything about, because she remembered his condition, and she found that she honored it not from obligation, but because it was simply the more truthful mode of operating. They stopped at a way station 2 hours from the outer Velmoran city boundaries. The riders made camp with practiced efficiency. Caedric sat beside a low fire with a cup of something hot, reviewing documents Corvin had brought, and Selene sat on the other side of the fire and looked at the southern stars, which were different from the northern ones, denser, warmer, arranged in the specific familiar patterns she'd stopped letting herself miss. "Tell me something," she said. He looked up. "The lords and ladies at this ceremony, they're going to be curious about your reasons for being there, about what's between us." "Yes." "What do you want me to say?" He set his documents down. "What do you want to say?" "That's not an answer. It's the correct one," he said. "I don't have a version of this that I need you to maintain for my benefit. Whatever you say will be believed because of who I am, and whatever I say will be believed for the same reason, and we are not required to match those stories because we don't answer to the same court." He looked at her steadily. "So what do you want to say?" She turned the question over. What did she want them to think? What story would serve her genuinely in that room? "I want them to think I'm someone worth choosing," she said. Then more quietly, "I want to believe that myself, again." He was quiet for a moment. The fire moved between them. "You negotiated Merrick's Eastern Treaty Corridor," Caedric said, "the one that secured access to the Delvin Passes. The terms were better than anything his own advisors had managed in 3 prior attempts." She stared at him. "How do you know the details of that?" "Because I was on the other side of one of those failed attempts." He returned to his documents. "You were not someone worth choosing because of who chose you or didn't. You were that before he found you and after he left." He turned a page. "That's not encouragement. It's a documented fact." She sat with that beside the fire for a long time. She had forgotten, she realized, what it felt like to be seen as capable rather than as a consequence. For months she'd been defined, in her own internal accounting and in whatever whispers still moved through Velmoran court channels, by what had been done to her. The dissolution, the rejection, the summons delivered before dawn by someone who didn't want to knock. Caedric had not once, in 6 days, looked at her like a wound. He'd looked at her like a variable to be understood, which was, in its own unsentimental way, exactly what she needed. They arrived at the outer gates of Black Hollow Palace on the morning of the ceremony, and the effect was immediate and visible. She had known, intellectually, that the sight of Caedric Thorne's Northern Riders appearing at a Velmora event would generate attention. Corvin had prepared her for the restructuring of the room's calculations. She had thought she was ready. She had underestimated the stillness. Not noise, not commotion. Stillness. The kind that falls on a crowd when it has collectively registered something it has not yet decided how to process. The gate guards, trained and composed, held their posts, but their eyes moved in ways that undermined the composure. The courtyard staff who had been moving between tasks all stopped, not obviously, but completely. Caedric rode through the gates like he'd been there before, and found it adequately constructed. She rode beside him. The first person she recognized was Aldrich, Draven's secretary, who was standing near the courtyard entrance with a clipboard, and the expression of a man whose understanding of this day's event schedule had just been comprehensively revised. He saw her. He saw who she was riding beside. Something moved across his face that she could not quite name, but suspected was the administrative equivalent of a disaster alarm. "They didn't know I was bringing company," she said quietly to Caedric. "No," he agreed. "Should I have told them?" He glanced at her briefly. "Did the summons specify who you could bring?" She thought about it. "No." "Then you didn't violate any terms." She felt something unfamiliar move through her, something adjacent to satisfaction, but not quite, something quieter and more private. She filed it away. Aldrich approached them as they dismounted, his clipboard held against his chest like a small shield. "Miss Vaelor," he said, and to his credit his voice was level. This is unexpected." "I received the summons," she said pleasantly. "I assumed Lord Merrick would want me to honor it." Aldrich's eyes moved to Caedric. Something in Aldrich's posture changed in the way of a man who is internally revising every plan he'd made for this day. "King Thorne," Aldrich said carefully, "we were not aware you had plans to attend." "I don't," Caedric said. "I have plans to escort." He handed his horse to one of his riders without looking and walked forward. And the thing about his movement was that it simply assumed the path would clear, not aggressively, not with any visible force, but with the calm expectation of a man who had never in his memory had that assumption fail. And so the path cleared. Selene fell into step beside him. She did not look around for Draven. She had promised herself she wouldn't, and she kept it. But she felt the shift in the courtyard as they moved through it. The calculations resetting, the stories being rewritten in real time, the particular social mathematics of a court environment receiving new data and processing it into new hierarchy. For the first time since the dissolution, she was not the figure people pitied. She was the variable that changed everything. They were given rooms in the East Wing, which Selene recognized as a diplomatic placement. Not insult, not honor, but careful neutral distance. She set her travel bag on the bed in the room she was assigned and stood at the window looking out at the east courtyard for a while, letting herself feel the strangeness of being back inside these walls. Black Hollow Palace had been a second home to her for years. She knew which corridors ran cold in winter and which staircases had uneven steps. She knew the paintings in the East Gallery and where the Moon Court records were stored and which of the kitchen staff made the best coffee. It was her institution as much as Draven's, and she had given it to him when she left, the same way she'd given him everything she'd built. She hadn't expected the grief of it to be about the place. That surprised her. She was still at the window 20 minutes later when a knock came at the door and she said, "Enter," and Caedric came in, which was also surprising. She'd half expected Corvin with information or a palace functionary with logistics. He looked at her at the window and said, "How are you?" She turned. "Fine." "That's not what you promised me," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back out the window. "I forgot how much I know this place," she said. It's an unexpected thing to grieve." "Yes," he said simply. "I thought the hard part was going to be seeing him. It might still be." "I know." She pressed her palm flat against the glass. The cold of it helped. "I know what I'm doing tonight and why. I've been clear with myself about it for 10 days. But there's a part of this that no amount of clarity helps with." She paused. "The just having to be in the room part." "Yes," he said again. "Is that—" She stopped, tried again. "Does that get easier?" "With experience." I was quiet long enough that she knew he was not going to give her a comfortable answer, which she had already learned to trust as a sign that his actual answer would be useful. "You stop expecting it to not hurt," he said. "That's different from it getting easier. But it's more honest, and honesty about cost is the only thing that keeps you from being surprised by the bill. She turned from the window. He was standing near the doorway, not entering the room further, which she noted. "Tonight," she said, "when we walk in, what do I do?" "Walk," he said. "Don't look for him first. Don't look for her. Look at the room like it's a geography you're assessing. Like a strategist. Like someone who belongs in rooms like this," he said, "which you do, regardless of what was decided here about you." She held his gaze for a moment. Something she'd been carrying for months shifted very slightly, not gone, but repositioned. A weight moved to a more manageable place. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "The evening hasn't started." She almost laughed. It surprised her. He left and she stood in the quiet of the East Wing room getting dressed for the ceremony, and she let herself feel the fear and the grief and the strange rising thing underneath them that she could not yet name. She was here. She had gotten herself here on her own terms. Whatever came next, that was already true. She was ready when Caedric came to her door. He had changed into formal northern attire, dark fabric, severe cut, the kind of clothes that made no concessions to decoration and needed none. He looked at her without comment for a moment, and she looked back. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said honestly. "Let's go." They moved through the palace corridor toward the grand hall. The sounds of the gathering reached them before the doors did. Voices, movement, the particular ambient frequency of a large formal event gathering itself into occasion. She breathed evenly. She kept her eyes forward. Caedric walked at her side with that absolute, unhurried gravity of his, and she felt the shape of what they were about to do settle into clarity. The doors were ahead. Behind them, the entire court. Behind those, Draven and Seraphine and 5 years of her own life arranged around a man who had chosen otherwise. She put her hand on her own future and pushed the door open. And the room went absolutely, completely still. And across the silver-lit hall, through 50 feet of silenced crowd, her eyes found Draven's before she meant them to. And she saw in his face not triumph, not indifference, but something raw and unprepared and entirely human. And standing 4 feet from Draven, watching her with an expression she had never seen on any face before, was Seraphine Dorn. Not in gold silk, but pale, shaking, holding what appeared to be a document she had clearly been reading moments before, a document that had clearly caused her hands to lose their steadiness, a document whose seal Selene could just make out from 50 feet away, a seal she recognized, her father's seal, her dead father's seal, on a document that should not exist, in a palace where she had been told he had never once set foot. Caedric went very still beside her. His hand found the small of her back, not romantic, not performative, but the specific stillness of a man who has just felt the ground shift and is steadying the person beside him. "Selene," he said quietly. "I see it," she said. Her voice came out even, completely even. The room didn't know what it was watching yet, but whatever Seraphine was holding, whatever that document said, the evening had just become something far larger than a mating ceremony. And somewhere in Selene Vaelor's chest, the grief she had carried for months caught fire and became something else entirely. Not revenge, not love. The specific, dangerous clarity of someone who has just understood the real shape of the war she is standing in. The room did not move. 50 people holding a collective breath is a specific kind of silence. Not empty, not peaceful, but pressurized, the way air feels before a storm front arrives, and everything living goes quiet because something ancient in the blood knows what's coming. Selene stood in the doorway with Caedric's hand at the small of her back and felt that pressure against her skin like a second heartbeat, and she did not look away from the document in Seraphine Dorn's shaking hands, her father's seal. Marin Vaelor had been dead for 9 years. His personal seal, the double crescent mark he'd pressed into every document he'd ever signed, the one she'd watched him use 100 times across a childhood spent in his study, should have been buried with him, or destroyed, or at minimum existing in a private archive she'd never been able to access because his records had been categorized as closed by the Velmoran succession courts the year after he died. Not here, not in Seraphine Dorn's hand, not tonight. Caedric said her name again, quietly, and the quality of his voice told her he was not alarmed, which was itself alarming, because it suggested he was containing something larger than alarm. "Walk forward," he said. "Don't stop in the doorway." She walked forward. This was the first lesson Caedric had given her on the road south. Though she hadn't recognized it as a lesson at the time, he'd said it while watching her hesitate at the edge of a river crossing on the third day of travel, the bridge narrower than she'd anticipated, the drop on either side significant. He hadn't said anything encouraging. He'd just said, "Move through the thing you're afraid of at the same pace you'd move through the thing you're not. The fear doesn't get to change your gait." She moved through the doorway at the pace of someone who owned the floor beneath her feet. The court parted. Not dramatically, not with any single person visibly stepping aside, but the way a body of water parts around something solid and moving with conviction. An organic, almost unconscious rearrangement. She was aware of eyes tracking her. She was aware of the absence of sound. She was aware of Caedric at her shoulder moving with that absolute northern gravity of his. His presence not aggressive but immovable. The kind of immovable that doesn't need to assert itself because the fact of it is sufficient. She kept Seraphine in her peripheral vision without looking directly at her. Draven, she did not look at yet. This was choice, not avoidance. She had learned, somewhere in the rubble of the last 5 months, that the moment you look at the thing that hurt you is the moment you give it the shape it needs to hurt you with. You look when you're ready, not before. She was not ready yet. She was still reading the room. This was something Caedric had said to her on the 5th night, beside the dying fire while Corvin slept, and the Northern Riders kept their watch. Power is just information about the room, moving faster through you than through anyone else. That's all it is. People who have it aren't smarter or stronger. They've just learned to receive the room without filtering it through what they need the room to be. He'd said it without looking at her, his eyes on the fire, and she'd thought at the time that it was an interesting thing to say, and not recognized until now, standing in the Black Hollow Grand Hall, that he'd been teaching her something specific. She was receiving the room. What she received, confusion, first and most dominant. The court had expected a certain evening. They had their scripts. The ceremony, the formal acknowledgement of the Merrick Dorn Union, the precise social choreography of witnessing a lord's political ascension dressed in romantic language. They had not expected the discarded Luna to appear on the arm of a northern Alpha King, and the cognitive revision required to update their understanding was visible in faces she'd known for years. What she also received, something broken in the center of the room, not in Draven, though she still wasn't looking at him directly. In the geometric center of the formal arrangement, the altar space, the official witnesses, the elders in their ceremonial positions, something had gone wrong before she and Caedric arrived. She could read it in the body language of the elders, 2 of whom were angled toward each other in a posture of urgent consultation that the setting did not permit, and that they were engaging in anyway. And Seraphine, still holding the document, still pale, had not moved. Corvin materialized at Caedric's other shoulder with the smoothness of a man who had been somewhere in the hall already, waiting, which meant Caedric had positioned him here in advance, which meant Caedric had anticipated something. She filed that away for later. "The document," Corvin said quietly to Caedric. "It arrived by internal courier approximately 12 minutes ago. It was not sent from outside the palace." "Who?" Caedric said. "Unknown. The courier was palace staff. 3rd kitchen rotation. He didn't know what he was carrying." Selene kept her face composed and her voice below the ambient noise of the unsettled room. "What is it?" Corvin glanced at her with something she was beginning to recognize as respect expressed through economy of information. "A contract," he said, "dated 11 years ago, between the Dorn family and the Merrick house. We don't have the content yet. 11 years ago. Draven would have been building his early alliance network. Seraphine's family would have been in their peak political influence period before the contraction. 11 years ago, Selene's father was alive, and based on the seal on that document, apparently involved in whatever agreement had been made. Her father had been a territorial assessor. He had spent his career auditing land claims and succession agreements for the Velmora outer districts. He had been meticulous and honest in a profession where neither quality was particularly rewarded. He had died in a riding accident 9 years ago, 1 month after returning from what he'd called a complicated survey assignment in the border territories. She had never questioned the accident. She questioned it now. This is what betrayal actually looks like when you trace it back far enough. Not a single dramatic moment, but a geology of small, deliberate choices made by people you trusted, layered one over another over years, until the ground beneath you is entirely different from the ground you thought you were standing on. Selene had spent 5 months grieving a romantic rejection. Standing in the black hollow grand hall with her dead father's seal visible from across the room, she understood with a cold and clarifying certainty that she had been grieving the wrong wound. Selene. She turned. Draven was 3 feet away. She had not heard him cross the room, which meant either she'd been more inside her own head than she'd realized, or he'd moved with deliberate quiet, which, given everything she now suspected about deliberate choices, was a meaningful distinction. He looked the way she remembered, and did not look that way at all. 5 months had done something to his face, not aged it exactly, but tightened it, pulled the easy confidence inward, until what was left was something more defended and less certain. He was dressed for a ceremony. He looked like a man who had woken up expecting one kind of day and was now in a very different one. His eyes moved to Caedric for a single, calibrating second, then came back to her. "You came," he said. "You invited me," she said. "I didn't expect—" He stopped. Started again. "I didn't expect you to bring company. Your summons didn't specify who I could bring." Something moved in his jaw. Not anger exactly. The specific tension of a man who has built a position and is watching it become more complicated in real time. "We should talk." "We are talking." "Privately." "No," she said. Silence. He looked at her with the particular searching quality she'd spent years interpreting as depth, and now understood was more like the expression of a man trying to locate the version of a situation that was most manageable. He had always been more comfortable with manageable versions than true ones. She saw it very clearly now. It was strange how much clarity was available once you stopped needing someone. "There are things you don't understand," he said. "Tell me about the document," she said. His stillness was instant and complete. The kind of stillness that is not composure, but the sudden absence of movement in a body that has received a shock. He recovered fast. She'd always known he was fast, but she'd been trained by 6 days of Caedric Thorne to notice the fraction of a second before recovery, and what she saw there was fear. Not guilt. Fear. She noted the difference. "What document?" he said. "The one in Seraphine's hands," Selene said. "The one with my father's seal." He looked across the room. His face did something complicated and brief. Then he looked back at her, and this time the managed version was gone, and what was underneath it was rawer and less comfortable. "This isn't the time," he said. "You made me the offer of time," she said. "You sent the summons. You arranged this evening. I'm here, Draven, in the room you asked me to be in." She kept her voice level and quiet, not for his benefit but because Caedric was 2 feet away, and she'd promised honesty, and part of honesty was refusing to perform anger she didn't need to perform. "Tell me what that document is." "Selene," Caedric spoke. He said nothing dramatic. He didn't need to. He simply said, in the quiet and complete authority of his northern register, "Lord Merrick." 1 name, 2 words. But when Caedric Thorne said your name in a room full of people, it was a different order of address than when anyone else did. Draven turned. They looked at each other, the Alpha Lord of the Merrick Empire and the Alpha King of Ashenvale, and the specific political mathematics of that moment rearranged every calculation in the room a second time. Draven was powerful. Selene knew that, had known it for years, had helped build that power piece by piece. But power has a spectrum, and at the end of that spectrum, in the range occupied by men like Caedric, it was less about individual force and more about accumulated weight. The weight of wars ended, empires consolidated, dynasties unmade. The kind of power that didn't need to make noise. Draven was smart enough to feel the difference. "King Thorne," he said carefully. "I have a question," Caedric said, and his voice was conversational, utterly without threat, which was somehow more effective than threat. "The council elders who have been in urgent consultation for the last 8 minutes, are they part of the official witness panel for tonight's ceremony?" Draven blinked. "Yes." "Then their consultation is a procedural irregularity," Caedric said. "Official witnesses in Velmoran's ceremony protocol are bound to neutral observation until the ceremonial conclusion. If they're consulting about something, it is either an emergency that supersedes the ceremony, or it is something they should not be discussing in this setting." He let that sit for one breath. "Which is it?" Draven had no good answer to this because both options were damaging. Selene watched him understand that in real time. "I'll address it," Draven said. "I'll come with you," Caedric said. It was not a request. It was stated with the calm of someone noting an intention, the way you note that you intend to take a particular road. Not aggressive, not negotiable, simply factual. And Draven, who had built his empire on understanding when a room had shifted beyond his control, understood. He nodded once and turned, and Caedric followed, and Selene fell into step at Caedric's side because she had not survived 5 months of rebuilding herself in a cold flat in Ravengate, to stand at the edge of this room while the answers about her father were 3 feet away. The elder consultation was happening in the alcove behind the official witness platform, a half-concealed space that ceremony tradition designated as a waiting area, but that the 3 elders were using as something considerably more urgent. Elder Voss, who had been the oldest member of the Velmoran Ceremonial Council for as long as anyone in the court could remember, had a copy of what appeared to be the same document Seraphine was holding, and he was not reading it with the expression of a man encountering routine paperwork. He looked up when they arrived. He looked at Draven. He looked at Caedric. He looked at Selene. "Selene Vaelor's daughter," he said quietly. "Yes," Selene said. Voss was the kind of old that is less about age and more about accumulated weight. A man who had witnessed enough ceremony and consequence to have stopped being surprised by most things. He was clearly surprised now. But the surprise had in it something that was not quite guilt and not quite relief, and was definitely recognition. "You should have been told," he said. "Told what?" Selene said. He looked at Draven. Draven said nothing. This is the thing about people who construct their lives around the management of information. They are very good at withholding, and very bad at the moment when withholding stops being an option. Draven had spent years managing what people knew and when they knew it, building his empire not just through alliance and force, but through the strategic release of information at times of his choosing. Standing in the alcove behind the ceremony platform with Elder Voss looking at him with that particular expression, and Caedric Thorne occupying the kind of space that made dishonesty feel structurally impossible, Draven Merrick looked like a man who had arrived at the edge of a thing he'd been moving away from for years and had run out of room. "The contract," Draven said, finally, to Selene. "It predates you and me. It predates almost everything you knew about my house." "Tell me," she said. He breathed. 11 years ago, my house made an agreement with the Dorn family. Territorial access, political alliance, shared interests in the border expansion corridors. He paused. "Your father was the assessor assigned to verify the territorial claims underlying the agreement." And he found irregularities, Voss said, when Draven didn't continue. "In the boundary surveys, in the succession documentation, the territories being claimed by both families had prior claimants that had been removed from the official records." Selene felt something move through her chest. Cold, specific. "Removed. The records were altered," Voss said, "after the original survey was completed. Your father documented the irregularities in a secondary report filed through the independent assessor's office." He touched the document in his hand. "This is that report, sealed under his authority, filed in the assessor's archive 11 years ago. It surfaced tonight because the independent archive was finally unsealed as part of a consolidation order that went through 3 months ago. Someone in the records office made an administrative connection and forwarded it to the relevant parties." Relevant parties. Her father's report. Her father, who had died 1 month after completing a survey assignment in the border territories. She said, "Who altered the records?" Silence. "Who altered the records?" she said again, and her voice was the same as before, level and quiet, but something in it had shifted, the way the register of a river shifts when the channel narrows and the same volume of water moves faster through less space. Draven said, "I don't know who specifically altered them, but you knew they were altered." He didn't answer, which was an answer. Here is what most people don't understand about the moment of revelation. They expect it to feel like explosion, like something tearing open. What it actually feels like for people who have already spent months rebuilding themselves from the previous collapse is more like a very large and very cold thing settling into a place that was already cleared for it. Selene had known, somewhere below conscious thought, since the moment she saw her father's seal across the hall, that what she was about to learn was going to be larger than heartbreak. She had been right. "You brought me into your house," she said to Draven. "You partnered with me. For 5 years you had access to everything I knew, everything I thought, every analysis I made." Her voice was still level. "Did you choose me because of my work, or because my father was the assessor who documented your irregularities, and you wanted to know how much I knew?" The alcove was very quiet. Caedric was completely still beside her, and she understood now why he'd come. Not just for political positioning, not just for the structural advantage of his presence. He had come because Corvin's preliminary intelligence had suggested there was something older and more deliberate underneath the romantic betrayal, and he had not wanted her to be alone when she found it. Draven said, It didn't start as that. But that was part of it. He looked at her with the raw and unmanaged thing she'd seen briefly before, and it was worse than she'd prepared for because it was genuine. Not a managed version, the actual face of a man who had done a calculated thing, and then, at some unpredictable point in the middle of doing it, found himself not calculating anymore, and not known what to do with that transition. At the beginning, he said, Yes, I knew your father's name. I knew he'd filed a secondary report. I didn't know where it was or if it could be found. I wanted proximity to anything that might surface it, so I could manage it. And then, Caedric said, not loudly, just into the space where Draven had stopped. Draven looked at him. And then I wasn't managing anything, he said. And I didn't know how to be in that situation. I had built everything on management, on controlled outcomes, and He stopped. Say it, Selene said. You were ungovernable, he said quietly. Not difficult, not resistant. Just genuinely, completely yourself, in a way I didn't have a framework for. And I didn't know how to hold something I couldn't position. He looked at the floor for a moment. Seraphine was easier. The Dorn alliance was straightforward. The terms were known. I could manage what that was going to be. You traded me for something you could control, Selene said. Yes. This she had not expected. Not the honesty. She had expected more management, more calibrated release of information, more of the careful political self-presentation she'd watched him deploy for years. The flat, undefended yes was something different. She did not know what to do with it yet, so she set it aside. She turned to Voss. My father's accident. Voss's expression was precise and painful. The assessor's office conducted an inquiry at the time. The findings were inconclusive. Who conducted the inquiry? The Border Territories Authority. Who was under whose jurisdictional authority 11 years ago? Silence. Then Voss said, The Dorn family held oversight of the Border Territories Authority at that time. There it was. Not proof. Not yet. But the shape of a thing that had been hiding in plain sight for 9 years, the shape of her father working late, coming home quieter than usual, telling her he'd found something complicated in the border surveys, and that he needed to think about the right way to handle it, and then going back out on the road and not coming back. She had been 19 years old when he died. She had cried for 6 months and then built a life because that was what you did, and because she had believed it was an accident and because no one had ever given her a reason to believe otherwise. She breathed. The breath came out shaky, which she noted and did not perform and did not suppress. She just let it be what it was, because Caedric was standing beside her, and she had made a promise about honesty, and she intended to keep it even in the alcove behind the ceremony platform, with her 9 years of grief being reoriented into something with a different name. Caedric's hand found her arm. Not the small of her back this time. Her arm, which was different, which was steadying in a more direct and material sense, and she did not move away from it. Elder Voss, Caedric said, the document in your possession and the copy in Lady Dorn's possession. Are they original or reproduced? Original, Voss said. Both copies were filed simultaneously by the assessor's protocol, one for the independent archive, one for the involved party's file. Then they constitute legal documentation of the irregularities your office is bound to report to the Velmoran succession courts. Voss looked at him carefully. That would trigger a formal investigation into the territorial claims underlying several significant property agreements. Yes, Caedric said, including agreements that form the basis of the Merrick House's Eastern Corridor holdings. Yes, Caedric said again. Draven said nothing. His face had gone to a place beyond management now. Not defeated, not broken, but stripped. The expression of a man looking at the full cost of his own construction for the first time. And the Dorn family's claims, Selene said. The territories underlying the contract, they're also affected. Yes, Voss said. So the marriage, Selene said slowly, the political expansion Draven wanted through the Dorn alliance, the territorial basis for that expansion is fraudulent. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then, the investigation would determine that. But the assessment exists. My father's assessment exists in this document, and it contradicts the official records. Yes, she turned to Draven. He was looking at her, and she let him look, and she looked back, and she found something she hadn't expected to find. She wasn't angry, or rather she was, but anger wasn't the primary register. What she was, more than angry, more than grieving, more than anything else she might have predicted she'd feel in this moment, was awake. Completely, electrically, dangerously awake. She had come here to survive beautifully in front of the man who expected her destruction. She had come to be witnessed, standing, intact, and unbroken. She had bargained for an escort and received instead a complete restructuring of the ground beneath everything. This is what survival actually requires. Not the performance of strength, but the willingness to receive the full truth of what you're surviving. Selene Vaelor had been surviving a romantic rejection for 5 months. She understood now that she had been surviving something vastly larger without knowing its shape. And in the strange calculus of catastrophe, there was something almost like relief in finally seeing the whole of it, because the whole of it, however enormous, was finite. It had edges. It was a knowable thing. Unknowable things were what destroyed you. She turned to Caedric. He was already looking at her with that gray, complete attention. "I want the investigation open tonight," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not the almost smile she'd seen before. Something more direct than that. "Corvin has already drafted the formal request to the succession courts. I was waiting to see if you wanted to make the choice yourself." "You knew," she said. "I suspected," he said. "The intelligence we gathered in 2 days was sufficient to suggest the irregularities existed. I didn't know about your father specifically. But you came anyway." "Yes." She held that. Then, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him consider the honest answer against the several less honest ones available to him. And she watched him choose the honest one because that was apparently, she was beginning to understand, simply what he did. "Because something in your letter was true in a way that didn't fit the situation you described," he said. "People who have been simply rejected don't write letters like that. There was a weight in it that didn't match the surface story." His gray eyes were steady. "I wanted to know what the real weight was." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and turned back to the room. Behind them, in the grand hall, the ceremony that was supposed to be happening tonight was not happening. She could hear the ambient frequency of the gathered court shifting. Not panic, not chaos, but the specific collective sound of people updating their understanding of the evening, which was different and in some ways more significant than panic, because it meant the room had accepted that something had changed. Draven said, "Selene." She looked at him one last time over her shoulder. "I was standing in the alcove with the document in the elder's hands, and the weight of 11 years of construction on his face, and the particular loneliness of a man who has just understood that the thing he built and the thing he wanted were never the same thing. I'm sorry," he said, "not for the dissolution." She understood that. Not for choosing Seraphine, or for the management, or for the 5 months she'd spent rebuilding herself in a cold flat in Ravengate. He was sorry for the beginning, for using her name as a shield against her father's truth. She considered what to say. She considered silence. She considered the several versions of this moment she had rehearsed in her head over 5 months of sleepless hours, and found that none of them fit, because none of them had accounted for the thing she now knew. She said, "I know," and she walked out of the alcove. Caedric fell into step beside her as she re-entered the grand hall, and the room did what it had done before. Restructured itself around them, recalculated, revised. But this time Selene was not receiving the room from behind glass. She was fully in it, feeling every current of it, every shift of social weight, every recalibrated gaze. And across the hall, standing very still near the official altar, was Seraphine Dorn. The document was no longer in her hands. She had set it down, or given it to someone. But she was watching Selene move through the room, and her face was doing something complicated and unguarded that the evening's formal occasion had clearly not prepared her for. Selene walked toward her. She was aware of Caedric behind her, aware that the room was tracking this movement, aware that what she was about to do was either very right or very wrong, and that there was genuinely no way to know until she did it. She stopped 3 feet from Seraphine. Seraphine was beautiful in the way that power and expectation produce beauty. Everything maintained, everything positioned, everything calibrated for maximum effect. Tonight that calibration had slipped. She was pale under the ceremonial gold. Her hands, unoccupied now, were not quite still. You read it, Selene said. Seraphine said, yes. Did you know, before tonight? A long pause. The kind of pause that is not thinking, but deciding how much honesty the situation can hold. My family knew there were irregularities in the territorial assessments, Seraphine said finally. I knew it was managed. I didn't know the details. I didn't know about your father specifically. But you knew the foundation was not clean. Seraphine's jaw tightened. In this empire, nothing is built on clean foundations. No, Selene said. But there's a difference between building on old imperfect ground and building on a grave. Seraphine's eyes went very still. The investigation will find what it finds, Selene said. That's not something I'm doing to you. It was going to surface eventually. The records office consolidation would have found it whether or not I was standing in this hall tonight. She paused. But I want you to know something. What? I'm not here for you, Selene said. I'm not here for him. I came here because I was told to come as a prop in someone else's story, and I decided not to do that. She held Seraphine's gaze. Whatever happens to your family's agreements, that's the law working. That's not me. Seraphine looked at her with something that was not gratitude and was not resentment either, but was closer to the complicated human space between them, where two women stand who have been positioned as enemies by a man's choices without having made that choice themselves. Why are you telling me this? Seraphine said. Because someone should, Selene said, and because no one else in this room is going to. She turned and found Caedric immediately behind her, close enough that she nearly walked into him, which, given the stillness of his movement, she suspected was deliberate. The succession court representative, he said quietly. Corvin has him. The formal request can be filed before midnight. Do it, she said. He looked at her. It will restructure everything. I know. Your father's assessment. It may take months to fully investigate. The territorial claims, the succession agreements, the border authority records. This doesn't end tonight. I know, she said again. You were supposed to come here, be seen, and leave. She looked at him. You told me you suspected there was something larger. You came anyway. You had Corvin draft the request in advance. You positioned your people inside this hall before I knew any of this. She held his gaze. You knew this wasn't going to end with me being seen and leaving. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Why? The gray clarity of his eyes was fully on her, and she felt the weight of it, the way she'd felt the cold of the window glass in the East Wing room. Real, material, something her body registered as actual temperature. Because you asked to be witnessed, he said. And what you didn't know yet was that what needed witnessing was larger than you were seeing. He paused. I didn't tell you because you needed to walk into this room without knowing. If you'd known the scale of it coming in, you would have performed. You can't receive a room clearly if you're already in a scene. She stared at him. You used me, she said. Yes, he said. And I found what I expected to find, which is that you could hold it, all of it. He held her gaze. Was I wrong about that? She looked around the room. The court still processing, the elders in motion. The ceremony dissolved before it had concluded. Draven somewhere behind her with the full weight of his construction settling on him. Seraphine standing at the altar with everything she thought tonight would be restructuring around her. Her father's name on a document that should not exist. 9 years of an accident that was not an accident. An investigation that would take months and dismantle agreements and resurface buried things. She looked back at Caedric. No, she said. You weren't wrong. He nodded once. Then there's one more thing, he said. What? Corvin found something else in the records review. Something that doesn't connect to the territorial claims or the succession agreements. He paused. It connects to you specifically. She felt the thing in her chest, that cold, specific weight, shift and tighten. Tell me. Not here, he said. Tonight, after this is done. There's a reason I need you to hear it somewhere without an audience. She held his gaze for a long moment, reading the gray clarity of it for whatever she could find. She found seriousness, concern of a very controlled variety, and something underneath both that she had no name for yet, but that her body registered as significant. Is it worse than what I already know? She said. He considered this with the particular honesty she'd come to expect from him. It's different, he said. Whether it's worse depends on what you do with it. She breathed. Around them, the Black Hollow Grand Hall was restructuring itself into the beginning of a very long investigation, and the ceremony that was supposed to be tonight's event had dissolved entirely, And somewhere in the palace, Draven Merrick was sitting with the full weight of 11 years of managed truth. And in her hands, though she was not yet holding it, was something Caedric knew that she did not. Something about her, specifically. Something that would determine not just what she survived, but what she could become. She said, "After." "After," he agreed. And they stood together in the restructured room, and outside the palace the Velmoran night was cold and clear, and somewhere in the city's court archives a set of records was already being pulled that would, by morning, change everything Selene Vaelor understood about who she had been before the betrayal, before the dissolution, before all of it. Who she had been before she was old enough to know that the ground beneath her had never been what she was told. The East Wing room was smaller than it had seemed when she'd dressed for the ceremony 2 hours ago. That was the thing about returning to a space after the world had restructured itself. The walls didn't move, but the proportions changed because you had changed, and a room sized for one version of you felt wrong around a different one. Caedric stood near the window. Corvin sat at the small table with a leather satchel in front of him that he had not opened yet. 2 candles on the mantel, because the lamp had gone out somewhere in the last hour, and no one had replaced it, and neither of them had asked. Selene stood in the center of the room and waited. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical labor. The exhaustion of sustained clarity, of receiving information that keeps arriving in larger shapes than the one before it, of staying upright through successive waves of revelation. She was feeling it now, in the specific way it settles into the back of the neck and the space behind the sternum, the body registering what the mind is still managing. She did not sit down. She had decided, without consciously deciding, that she was going to receive whatever was in that satchel on her feet. "Tell me," she said. Corvin looked at Caedric. Caedric nodded once. Corvin opened the satchel and removed a document, thicker than the one bearing her father's seal, bound with a cord that had been cut recently. He set it on the table but did not push it toward her. He looked at it for a moment the way people look at things they have had to carry and are not glad about carrying. "When we reviewed the records underlying the Dorne Merrick territorial agreements," Corvin said, "we pulled the full Assessor's Archive Index for the border territories. Your father's report was in it, so was something else." He paused. "A separate filing made in your father's name, 3 weeks before his accident. Not a survey, not an assessment." He looked up at her. "A petition of lineage correction." She did not know what that was. She said so. "In Velmoran succession law," Corvin said, "a petition of lineage correction is filed when a parent has reason to believe a registered birth record contains an error, specifically an error in the recorded parentage." He paused again. "It requires the petitioning parent to submit a sworn affidavit of the correction they're seeking, along with supporting documentation." Selene heard the words. She processed them in the way of someone standing very still inside a moving thing, tracking the direction of travel before she understood the destination. "Whose birth record?" she said. Corvin said, "Yours." The room was very quiet. The candles moved slightly in a draft from somewhere, and the shadows on the walls shifted and resettled, and Selene stood in the center of the East Wing room and felt the particular sensation of solid ground becoming liquid beneath her feet. Not suddenly, not with drama, but with the slow, comprehensive certainty of a foundation that has been eroding for a very long time and has finally, quietly, let go. She said, "My father, Marin Vaelor, he filed it?" "Yes," Corvin said. Then he was correcting his own records, his own entry as my father. Corvin's face was precise and careful. "He was correcting the identity of your mother's, the identity listed as your other parent." She looked at him for a long time. She looked at Caedric. Caedric was watching her with the full weight of his attention, not performing concern, not managing the moment, just present, completely and without reservation. "Who did he list?" she said. Corvin reached into the satchel again and removed a second document, smaller, a single page, and this one he did push toward her. She crossed the room and picked it up and read it. And she read it twice because the first time the words arranged themselves in shapes she could not fully accept. And the second time she read it slowly enough that each word had room to settle into its meaning before the next arrived. Marin Vaelor's sworn affidavit, his handwriting, tight and rightward slanting the way she'd known her whole life. The same hand that had written her name on her first atlas, on birthday letters, on the assessment reports that now formed the foundation of a succession court investigation. His hand, his words. His declaration, sworn and sealed, that the birth record of Selene Vaelor contained an error in the field designating secondary parentage, and that the correct name to be listed in that field was not the name that had appeared there for 19 years before his death. The correct name was Aldrich Voss, Elder Voss, the man who had been standing in the alcove behind the ceremony platform tonight with her father's report in his hands, and the expression of someone who knew more than he'd said. She set the document down on the table with a precision that was not composure, but the last remaining function of the discipline that had kept her upright through the last several hours. She pressed both hands flat against the wood. She breathed. This is what it costs to follow truth all the way down. You start with a romantic rejection, a document you weren't supposed to see, a seal you recognized, and you follow the thread because that's what you are, someone who follows threads. Someone who was trained by 5 years of political infrastructure work to keep pulling when something doesn't add up. And at the bottom of the thread, when you've pulled long enough, you don't find the thing you started looking for. You find something you were never looking for at all. Something that redefines not just the recent past, but the entire architecture of what you understood your life to be. Selene's father was Marin Vaelor. She had never not known that. He had raised her, fed her, taught her cartography and contract law, and how to read the politics of a room before she was old enough to have politics of her own. He had been thorough and honest in a way that the world had not rewarded and had not seemed to mind. He had called her his greatest survey, the one he'd gotten perfectly right. He had also, 3 weeks before he died, sworn before the Velmoran courts that Elder Voss was her biological father. She turned to Caedric. He knew, she said. Voss, tonight, in the alcove, he knew about this petition. I think so, Caedric said. He looked at me and said, Marin Vaelor's daughter, she said. Not the assessor's daughter, not Selene Vaelor. He said, he named him specifically, like he needed to say it out loud. She felt something moving through her chest. Not grief yet, something harder than grief. He was acknowledging it, without stating it. Yes, Caedric said. She looked at Corvin. The petition, was it processed? Was the correction ever made to the official record? No, Corvin said. Your father died before the petition was formally reviewed. Under Velmoran succession law, a lineage petition lapses if the filing parent dies before the review hearing. The original record stands. He paused. You are officially, legally, exclusively Marin Vaelor's daughter. But biologically. The affidavit suggests otherwise. An affidavit is not proof, but it is sworn testimony. She moved away from the table. She walked to the window where Caedric was standing, and she looked out at the Velmoran night, the palace courtyard below, lit by mounted torches, a few of Caedric's riders still at their posts, the eastern wall rising dark against a sky that had no moon tonight. And she breathed the way you breathe when you are deciding whether to fall apart or continue, when the space between those two options has compressed to the width of a single deliberate exhale. She continued, this is the thing about people who are raised by honest ones. They have an appetite for truth that is almost punishing in its persistence. Marin Vaelor had been the most honest man she'd ever known, and she understood now that the honesty had cost him everything, had been the precise quality that made him file a petition he knew was dangerous, document irregularities he knew would make powerful people uncomfortable, and ride back into the border territories one final time because the survey was not finished and he was constitutionally incapable of leaving a thing incomplete. He had raised her to be the same. She was. Voss is still in the palace, she said. Caedric said, yes. I want to talk to him. He looked at her for a moment. She expected him to say it was late, or that she'd received enough tonight, or that it could wait until morning. He said none of those things. He moved to the door and said something brief to the guard outside, and then he turned back to her. Give him 10 minutes to be found, he said. Fine. She sat down then, because her legs had finally registered a preference on the matter, and she sat in the chair by the cold fireplace and looked at the document she'd set on the table and let herself feel the full shape of what she was sitting inside. She had come to this palace to be witnessed surviving. She had survived. She had also, in the process, uncovered the buried foundations of her own origin. A man she loved as father who had carried a secret serious enough to die for. Another man who had stood 30 feet from her tonight without volunteering a word of it. And somewhere beneath all of it, the specific shape of why her life had been positioned the way it had been. why she had ended up in Draven's orbit, why the connections she'd always assumed were coincidental were possibly deliberate. Corvin said quietly from the table. There's one more piece. She looked at him. He reached into the satchel a third time. She thought distantly that she would come to have complicated feelings about that satchel for the rest of her life. The territorial claims in the irregularity report, he said. The lands that were removed from the official records to benefit the Dorne-Merrick agreement. He set a map on the table, a boundary survey, old lines and newer ones overlaid in different inks. These territories, he touched the map. The prior claimants that were removed from the record. She looked at the map. He pointed to a family name listed in the margin of the prior claim notation. She stared at it. Vaelor, the prior claimant to 3 of the disputed territories, removed from the official record 11 years ago, was listed under the Vaelor family name. Her family. She said, my father was the assessor assigned to verify those claims. Yes, Corvin said, and he was also the prior claimant whose interests were being erased by the agreement he was assessing. Yes. They assigned him deliberately, she said, knowing he would find the irregularities, knowing it put him in an impossible position, report truthfully and expose both the fraud and his own family's claim, or stay silent and allow the erasure. He reported truthfully, Corvin said, and someone made sure he didn't survive long enough to do anything about it. Silence. She sat with the map in front of her and her father's choice visible in every document on the table and felt something shift so far inside her that she didn't have a category for it yet. Not grief, not anger. Something older and more structural. The thing that moves in a person when the entire scaffolding of their understood history is replaced simultaneously with something true. The lands that had been erased from the official record 11 years ago. The claim under the Vaelor name. If the investigation confirmed the irregularities, if the prior claim was valid, if the erasure was reversed. She looked at Caedric. He had been watching her work through it. He said nothing, which was the correct thing because she needed to reach it herself, needed to follow the thread completely without someone handing her the end of it. If the territorial claim is restored, she said, the investigation would determine that, he said carefully. But theoretically. If the irregularity is confirmed, the original records are reinstated, the prior claims are valid, the Vaelor claim to those territories would be legally active. Yes, he said. I'm the last Vaelor. Yes, he said. She sat in the chair by the cold fireplace in the east wing room of Black Hollow Palace and understood, with a comprehensive and almost impersonal clarity, that she had arrived this evening as a discarded Luna seeking to be witnessed surviving her own rejection, and that she was leaving, eventually, when the night concluded, as something she had no adequate word for yet. Not a former Luna, not a discarded mate, not a woman defined by what had been done to her. Something with a claim. Something with a name on a document that predated everything Draven had built, everything the Dorne family had consolidated, everything the elaborate architecture of political convenience had been constructed to bury. The knock at the door came quietly. Caedric answered it and exchanged words with the guard outside and then stepped back to let Elder Voss into the room. Voss looked like a man who had been expecting a reckoning and had decided, somewhere in the 40 minutes since the alcove, to stop deferring it. He was old in the way Selene had noted earlier, accumulated weight, not mere years, but there was something stripped back in him now that hadn't been there before. The formal elder's composure was present but thinner, worn close to the bone. He looked at her. She looked at him. She did not know what she was feeling and did not try to name it. She just looked at him and waited. You read the petition, he said. Not a question. Yes, she said. Then you know. He stayed near the door, which she noted, not retreating but not assuming the room welcomed him further. What do you want to know? Everything, she said. Plainly, without the managed version. Something in his face shifted. The specific movement of a man releasing a grip he's held for a very long time. He moved to the edge of the room, a chair near the wall, and sat in it like someone who has carried something for 9 years and is finally setting it down. Your mother, he said. Lyra. She and Marin were already together when she and I... It was not a long thing. It was not an arrangement. It was the kind of thing that happens between people who understand each other and should not act on that understanding, and we acted on it anyway. He looked at the floor for a moment. She chose Marin. She had already chosen him. I understood that, and I honored it, and I did not know about you until much later. How much later? Selene said. After she died, he said. Marin came to me. You were 12. He had figured it out, not from her. She never told him. He figured it from the biological details, and from things only someone paying close attention would have noticed. He came to me and he told me what he knew, and he told me what he intended to do about it. Voss's hands were on his knees, not moving. He intended to do nothing. He wanted me to know. He wanted someone else to know. That was all. You were his daughter. I was clear about that. He wasn't asking for anything from me, and he wasn't offering anything. He needed to put it somewhere outside himself. She held this. He told you the truth, she said, even when he didn't have to. Yes, Voss said. That was Marin. Something moved across his face that she recognized as grief because she'd felt it herself. I watched you grow up from a distance after that. I had no role, and I was clear about that with myself. But when he died, when the accident happened, and I knew what the accident was, you knew, Selene said. He looked at her directly. I suspected. I could not prove it. The Border Territories Authority inquiry was conducted by people with interests I could not override. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that was neither calm nor managed. I have lived with that for 9 years. You could have told me. Yes, he said. You didn't. No. He looked at his hands. I told myself it would only complicate your life. I told myself you were doing well, that you had built something at the Merit Court, that disturbing the settled version of your history would cost you more than it gave you. He paused. I was also afraid. The honesty of it landed flatly in the room. No decoration, no defense. She studied him, the elder who had been a part of the ceremonial council for her entire adult life, who had witnessed Draven's dissolution of the bond, with an expression she had read at the time as neutral and now understood was something considerably more conflicted, and she felt the complicated and ungovernable thing that she had no name for continue to move through her. She was not going to give him absolution. She was also not going to perform a rage she didn't fully feel, because the truth was more complex than rage allowed for, and she had promised herself months ago, in the cold flat in Ravengate, that she was done performing emotions she didn't genuinely have. What she felt was something vast and quiet and slightly vertiginous, the feeling of standing at the top of a very high structure and understanding for the first time how high it actually is. The claim, she said, the Vaelor territorial claim in the prior records. Did you know about that? Voss looked up. Something shifted in his face. Surprise, genuine and unguarded. No, he said. I knew about the irregularities in the territorial assessments. I knew Marin had documented them. I didn't know the prior claim was filed under the Vaelor name. She watched his face for the tells she'd spent years learning to read in court environments. She found none. He was telling the truth, which meant even he didn't have the full picture, which meant the picture was larger than any one person in this room had seen completely. She turned to Caedric. He was standing with his arms at his sides, watching the room with the quality of attention she had come to understand was how he processed situations he considered significant, fully present, fully still, filing everything. If the Vaelor claim is active, she said to him, and the investigation confirms the irregularity, and the prior records are reinstated, how long does that process take? Months, he said, possibly longer. These agreements are layered into a significant portion of the Eastern Corridor holdings. Untangling them is not a short process. And in the meantime, the claimed territories are in dispute, he said. Under Velmoran law, disputed territories revert to protective custody of the Crown during investigation. Which Crown? She said. A pause. Velmora's. Velmora has a king, she said. The High Council appoints one when there's no ruling bloodline in active governance. When the last Velmoran king died 8 years ago, the High Council dissolved the royal seat pending political stabilization. She looked at him carefully. Is the royal seat still dissolved? Something in Caedric's expression shifted by approximately 1 degree, which she was beginning to understand was the equivalent for him of a considerable reaction. You know Velmoran succession law. I negotiated inside it for 5 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the royal seat is still technically dissolved. The High Council extended the stabilization period indefinitely 6 years ago. Then there's no Velmoran crown to hold the disputed territories in protective custody, she said. Under the succession statutes, when there is no active crown, Territorial disputes of this magnitude revert to the highest-ranking claimant present in the territory at the time of the dispute filing. Caedric looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, and would spend a long time afterward trying to accurately describe, not surprise exactly, because she was increasingly certain that complete surprise was not available to him, but something that was its nearest available equivalent. "You're the highest-ranking claimant," he said, "if the Vaelor claim is valid." "I'm the only claimant," she said. "I'm the last Vaelor." The room was very quiet. Voss had gone completely still in his chair. Corvin, who she had noticed did not typically make sounds that were not words, made a very small sound that was not exactly either. She heard her own heartbeat, that specific pressurized sound of blood moving fast through a body that has received too much information in too few hours, and is doing its best to continue functioning anyway. She heard it and felt it, and stood inside it and did not look away from what she had just said. She had come to this palace to survive beautifully in front of the man who expected her destruction. She had not expected to find a throne sitting in the rubble. This is the nature of buried things. They do not know they are buried. A claim suppressed, a record erased, a petition lapsed, mid-process does not become less real. It waits in the archive. It waits in the succession statute. It waits in the 9-year-old affidavit of a man too honest to falsify a record, even when the falsification would have protected him. And it waits until the administrative consolidation order comes through, and someone in the records office makes the connection and sends a document to the wrong ceremony in the right palace, and everything that was buried comes up through the surface all at once, the way things under pressure always do. Marin Vaelor had tried to correct her birth record 3 weeks before he died. He had tried to give Elder Voss a formal acknowledgement. He had documented the territorial irregularities in full. He had done every right thing a thorough and honest man could do in an empire that was not structured to reward thoroughness or honesty, and it had cost him everything. She was not going to let it cost him the outcome. Caedric moved. He crossed the room in the specific unhurried way of his, the way that covered ground without appearing to rush it, and he stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the scar along his jaw clearly in the candlelight, and could hear his voice at its actual unperformed register. "What you've just identified," he said, "is not a simple territorial dispute claim. You understand that?" "Yes," she said. "The succession statutes that would make you the primary holding authority for disputed territories in the absence of a Velmoran crown. They haven't been invoked in 40 years. There will be challenges. The Dorn family will not accept this without a fight. The noble council members who have interests in the Eastern Corridor holdings will not accept this without a fight." "I know," she said. "And fighting them means being a different kind of person than you've been," he said. "Not better or worse. Different. It means stepping into a position that is going to require you to operate at a scale that is significantly larger than anything you've operated at before." She looked at him. "I spent 5 years building someone else's empire," she said. "I know how to build." "Building is not the same as governing," he said. "Building is what you do for someone else's vision. Governing is when it's yours." He held her gaze. "That's a different weight." She heard him. She heard the thing beneath the words, too. Not a warning, exactly, not a discouragement, but the specific honesty of a man who had been governing for years telling her what it actually costs. Which was the same thing he'd done on the road south, when she'd asked if things got easier and he'd told her the truth instead of the comfortable version. She had trusted the truth then. She trusted it now. "I know," she said. "You haven't slept," he said. "You've received more in the last 4 hours than most people receive in a year." "Yes," she said. "The formal dispute filing can wait until morning. Nothing that was buried tonight is going anywhere before dawn." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Voss, still in his chair with the weight of 9 years finally set down. She looked at the documents on the table, her father's handwriting on multiple pages, the map with the Vaelor name in the margin, the petition that had lapsed and waited in an archive and surfaced at precisely the moment she was standing in the right palace to receive it. She thought about what Caedric had said on the 4th night of travel. "Uncertainty is the most expensive thing you can carry." She was not uncertain. That was the thing she needed to sit with and verify, but sitting with it for 30 seconds was enough. She was not uncertain. She was afraid, which was different, and she was exhausted, which was different, and she was grieving in at least 3 distinct registers simultaneously, but she was not uncertain. She knew what she was going to do. She looked at Voss. "Go get some sleep," she said. "I'll need to talk to you again in the morning, properly. Not about the documents." She paused. About him. About my father. What he was like in the parts you knew that I didn't. Voss stood slowly. He looked at her with the precise and painful thing she'd seen earlier, and then he nodded once, and he left. She looked at Corvin. He was already replacing documents in the satchel with the systematic care of a man who understood that some things needed to be kept ordered when everything around them was not. Get some sleep, she said. Both of you. Corvin looked at Caedric. Caedric said nothing, which was apparently confirmation, because Corvin closed the satchel, stood, and left with the quiet efficiency she'd come to expect from him. The room was suddenly very empty. She sat in the chair by the cold fireplace and looked at the dead candles, and the surviving ones, and the ceiling, and the door, and the window, and she let herself feel all of it. The grief that had been waiting since she saw her father's seal across the hall, the strangeness of Voss's name on the affidavit, the Vaelor claim on the map, the specific vertigo of standing at the edge of something large. And she did not try to manage any of it. She just let it exist. Caedric stayed. She was aware of him near the window, not sitting, not speaking, just present in that absolute unhurried way of his that she had stopped finding unsettling somewhere on the road south, and had started finding, she did not have a word for it that wasn't inadequate. Necessary, maybe. The closest available word. After a while she said, "Did you know it would be this large?" He said, "I knew it was going to be larger than what you could see from where you were standing. And you decided to help me see it." "I decided to stand close enough that you could," he said. She looked at the window, at the dark courtyard beyond it, at the specific texture of a night that had started as one thing and become another entirely. "I'm going to file the dispute in the morning," she said. "I know," he said. "It's going to be a long fight." "Yes," he said. "The Dorn family has resources I don't. The noble council members with corridor interests will align against me. I have a valid claim, a succession statute that hasn't been used in 40 years, and a dead man's affidavit. And the investigation into the irregularities," Caedric said, "which will validate the prior claim if the records confirm what the petition documents. That could take months. Yes. In the meantime, I'm a woman with a disputed claim and no house behind her and nowhere to operate from." He was quiet for a moment. She looked at him. He said, "The Ashenvale Embassy in Velmora territory maintains a suite of offices under Northern diplomatic protection. No Velmoran authority can enter without consent. No noble council pressure reaches inside that boundary." She held very still. "You're offering me a base," she said. "I'm noting that such a space exists," he said carefully. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "It's not nothing." She sat with it. She understood what it meant. Not romantically, not in the way the court would immediately assume, but in the specific political geography of her situation. Operating from a position with Northern diplomatic protection meant operating from a position of genuine structural safety, which was the one thing she did not currently have, and without which everything else she was trying to build was vulnerable in ways that would eventually matter. She also understood that accepting it changed the nature of what was between them, not in a way she was afraid of, in a way she needed to look at clearly. "Why?" she said. He looked at her with the gray clarity that was simply his baseline mode and said, "Because what you found tonight, the claim, the investigation, the succession statutes, it doesn't just affect you. The Eastern Corridor territories, if the irregularity is confirmed, share boundaries with Ashenvale's southern interests. What happens to those territories is a northern concern." "That's the political answer," she said. A pause. "Yes," he said. "What's the other one?" He turned from the window and looked at her directly, and the candle on the mantel was behind him, and his face was half in shadow and half in the specific color that candlelight makes on scarred skin, and he said, "I told you in the hall tonight that you were never asking to be saved, that you were asking to be witnessed." "Yes," she said. "I have not stopped witnessing," he said. "And what I am seeing is not what I agreed to escort to a ceremony. What I am seeing is something I don't have a prior example of." He said it without the cadence of a declaration, which was the precise quality that made it land the way it did. "No performance. Just fact," stated plainly, in the voice of a man who had chosen long ago to say only what he meant. She looked at him for a long time in the half-light of the East Wing room, with her father's handwriting on documents on the table, and her family name on a territorial map, and the full weight of the evening finally settling into its complete and actual shape. She said, "I'm going to be very difficult to be near for the next several months. I have fought 3 wars, he said. I have a tolerance for difficulty. She felt something move through her that she still did not have a precise name for, but that was warm and specific and nothing like what she had felt in this palace 5 months ago or at any point in the 5 months since. Not safe, exactly. Not that. Something more honest than safe. Witnessed. She stood up. She crossed the room to where the documents were, and she picked up the map with the Vaelor name in the margin, and she looked at it for a long time. Her family's claim, buried for 11 years, surfaced tonight in a palace she had entered expecting one story and left carrying a completely different one. She folded the map carefully and put it in the inner pocket of her coat. She was still Selene Vaelor, former Luna of the Merrick House, who had rebuilt herself in a cold flat in Ravengate, scrubbing copper bowls in a sink of cold water because she'd needed to hold on to something ordinary while the extraordinary settled. She was also the last of a lineage with a valid claim to disputed territories, and an investigation opening at dawn, and a succession statute unused for 40 years, and a name on a document that no amount of deliberate erasure had managed to permanently remove. She was both of those things. And in the morning, when the sun came up over Black Hollow Palace, and the Velmoran court woke to a night that had restructured everything they understood about power in this empire, she was going to be something larger than either. She was going to be someone they had to reckon with. She put her hand on her own future and held it there. And outside the palace, the Velmoran night was almost over, and somewhere in the archive the records waited, and somewhere in the morning the fight was already assembled and moving toward her. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the weight of what was coming was not the weight of something being done to her. It was the weight of something she was choosing. She looked at Caedric one last time before the night ended. "Tell Corvin," she said, "that I'll need to review the full succession statute archive before we file. I want to know every challenge they can raise before they raise it." He looked at her with that one degree of expression that was his version of something considerably larger. "He'll have it ready by dawn," he said. She nodded. And the thing that had been building since the moment she'd stood in a Ravengate flat, reading a summons she should have refused, since the moment she'd decided she was done being defined by what had been done to her, finally, completely, settled into its permanent shape. Not revenge. Not survival. Not even sovereignty, though that was the closest word available. It was authorship. She was done being a character in someone else's story. She was writing now. Dawn came into Black Hollow Palace the way it always had. Through the eastern windows first, the light arriving before the warmth, touching stone and glass, and the dust motes of a building that had stood long enough to have its own weather. Selene had watched it come. She had not slept. This was not insomnia or grief, or the particular restlessness of a mind that couldn't quiet itself. It was a choice, made somewhere in the hour before dawn, that she did not want to be found asleep when the morning started moving. Corvin had delivered the Succession Statute Archive at 5 in the morning, 2 leather-bound volumes and a sheaf of supplementary court rulings, without commentary or expression. She had read them by candlelight until the candles became unnecessary, and by the time the sun was fully over the eastern wall. She had read everything twice and made 43 notes in the margins of a blank ledger she'd found in the room's writing desk. She knew what they were going to try. The challenge would come on 3 fronts. First, they would dispute the validity of the Vaelor prior claim itself, argue that the removal from the official record had been performed through legitimate administrative process, not fraud, and that the current records represented the legally binding state regardless of what the prior documents showed. Second, they would challenge her standing to invoke the succession statute, argue that a lapsed lineage petition meant the Vaelor claim had no active legal heir, that she was officially and exclusively Meryn Vaelor's daughter, and Meryn Vaelor's family line held no connection to the territorial claim. Third, and this was the one she'd spent the most time on, they would move to accelerate a resolution to the dissolved royal seat before the investigation concluded, install a compliant High Council appointee who would then exercise Crown authority to hold the disputed territories in administrative suspension, effectively freezing her claim in procedural amber, while the Dorne and Merrick interests continued operating on the ground. That third move was the dangerous one. If they got a crown installed before the investigation confirmed the irregularity, the statutory protection she'd identified last night became inaccessible. She would have a valid claim on paper and no mechanism to enforce it. She needed the investigation confirmed and formally entered into the succession court records before they could seat a crown. She needed it done today. She was still working through the timeline when the knock came at the door. Not Corvin's quiet efficiency, something harder and less patient. She said enter. It was Draven. She had not expected this and did not perform surprise. She set her pen down and looked at him across the room with the full, clear attention she'd learned from 6 days of watching someone deploy it, and she waited. He looked like a man who had also not slept, but for different reasons. Not reading, not planning, but sitting somewhere with the weight of 11 years of managed choices pressing down on a frame that had not been built for that specific pressure. His formal ceremony clothes were gone, replaced with something more functional, and there was a quality to his face she hadn't seen in years, maybe ever. Not the managed composure, not the political presentation, not even the raw thing she'd seen briefly in the alcove. Something older and more fundamental, the face under all the faces. I know what you're filing this morning, he said. Then you know there's nothing to discuss, she said. There is. Tell me quickly, she said. I have work. He came into the room. He did not sit. He stopped near the center of it and looked at her the way people look at things they have studied for years and only now understand they have been reading incorrectly. The Noble Council is already moving, he said. 3 of the senior members were in private session before dawn. I know because Aldrich heard it from the chamber staff. He paused. They're going to move on the crown appointment today. They have a candidate ready. I know, she said. He blinked. You know. I identified the risk last night. I've been working the timeline. She looked at him steadily. Is this what you came to tell me? Because I already have it. I came to tell you who their candidate is, he said. She held still. Lord Casson, he said, of this Casson Bray House. He holds the Eastern administrative appointments for 4 of the 7 contested corridor districts. If he takes the crown appointment, he has direct jurisdiction over the disputed territories before any investigation can run. She knew Casson. She had negotiated against him twice during her Merrick years. A man of methodical appetites and minimal principle, effective in the way that a slow-moving but very large thing is effective, through accumulated weight rather than speed or intelligence. He would be manageable for the Noble Council, compliant to their interests, and a procedural nightmare for any claim that needed the investigation to run its natural course. Why are you telling me this? She said. Draven looked at the floor, then back at her. Because Aldrich told me something else. He told me the council members in session this morning were the same ones who signed off on the Border Territories Authority inquiry 9 years ago. He let that sit. The inquiry into your father's accident. The word accident sat in the room like something alive and unwelcome. They signed off on it, she said. Approved the scope and the conclusion, he said. I didn't know that last night. I had pieced together that the irregularity in the territorial records was a problem that had been managed, but I didn't know how far the management went. His jaw tightened. I knew your father had filed the secondary report. I was watching for any record of it surfacing. I did not know it was anything other than what it was called. She studied him for a long time. She was looking for the managed version, the calibrated release of information, the political self-presentation. And she did not find it. What she found was the same stripped quality she'd seen in the alcove, but more advanced, the expression of a man who has been inside a structure for so long he's adapted to its shape, and who has only now, in the light of what that structure actually is, understood what adaptation has cost him. You built your empire on their foundation, she said. The Noble Council members who managed the inquiry, the territorial agreements that buried my family's claim. You didn't create the corruption, but you benefited from it, and you chose not to look at its foundations too closely. Yes, he said, and now they're moving against me using the same mechanisms that managed your irregularities before you were useful to them. I was quiet for a moment. They'll move against you today. If Casson takes the appointment, your filing is dead before it enters the court. He held her gaze. I can slow it. I still have 2 council votes I can call in, men who owe me favors from the Eastern expansion negotiations. It won't stop the appointment, but it can delay the formal vote by 6 to 8 hours. She looked at him. Why? She said. The same question she'd asked Caedric the night before, in a different register. Because they killed your father, he said plainly. And I benefited from that. And I did not know it. And not knowing it does not make me clean. His voice was even and controlled, and underneath it was something that was neither managed nor performed. The specific register of a man who has discovered that the edifice he built his identity on is rotting at the base and has decided to stop pretending the smell isn't there. Call it debt. Call it whatever you need to call it. 6 hours is what I can give you. She held it. She assessed it. She looked at the man who had been the central figure of her life for 5 years, who had betrayed her with preference and not cruelty, who had used her proximity to manage a threat, and then found himself genuinely caught inside something he hadn't planned for, who had chosen status over love, not because love wasn't real, but because he was, at his core, someone who trusted manageable things more than true ones. She did not forgive him. She also did not need to. She said, "Hold the vote." He nodded once. He turned to leave. At the door, he stopped. "Selene," he said. "Don't," she said. He didn't. He left. She sat with the room for 30 seconds, then she stood and went to find Caedric. I was already in motion. She found him in the corridor outside the Ashenvale embassy offices with Corvin and 2 of his senior riders, and the quality of the activity around him had shifted from the contained readiness she'd observed since Grimset into something more active. People moving with specific purpose, messages being dispatched, the particular rhythm of a command structure executing a plan. He looked at her when she appeared, and she saw in the gray clarity of his eyes that he had also been awake since before dawn and had also been working. "Draven's holding 2 council votes," she said. 6 hours. "I know," he said. "Corvin had ears in that session from the start." She looked at Corvin. Corvin had the expression of a man who considered information interception a basic courtesy. "What do you have?" she said to Caedric. He turned and walked, and she fell into step beside him, because this was apparently how they worked, she had noticed. Decisions in motion rather than in stillness. "The succession court convenes at the 3rd hour. I have the formal dispute filing ready. It's been verified against the statute archive. It cites the prior claim documentation and the lapsed petition as supporting evidence for your standing as rightful heir." He paused. "There's a procedural mechanism I found in the supplementary rulings that may matter." "Which one?" she said. "Emergency Territorial Protection Order. Hasn't been invoked in 60 years. It requires 2 conditions: an active claim with documented evidence, and a demonstrated threat of imminent prejudicial action against that claim." He glanced at her. "The Noble Council's pre-dawn session, if documented, constitutes a demonstrated threat of imminent prejudicial action." She understood immediately. "If we file the protection order alongside the dispute filing, the court is required to issue a temporary hold on any actions affecting the disputed territories, including crown appointments, for the duration of the emergency review period." 48 hours, he said. "Minimum. Extendable if the court finds sufficient grounds." "That's more than 6 hours, she said. "Yes," he said. "Can you document the session, the Noble Council meeting?" "Already done," Corvin said from behind them, without being asked. She looked forward. The corridor opened into the embassy office suite, and she followed Caedric through, and the morning had that particular quality of things happening faster than is comfortable, the pace of events outrunning the normal speed of thought, requiring a different mode of processing, not deliberative, not reflective, but instantaneous, the specific mental gear of someone who has to make real decisions in real time with incomplete information and live with the outcomes. This was the gear she had been in for 5 years managing Draven's political infrastructure. She had thought she was learning it for him. She understood now she had been learning it for this. The filing took 40 minutes. She read every line. She changed 2 phrases, not from error, but because the precise word carried the precise weight. And in a legal filing before the succession court, the weight of each word was the weight of everything. Corvin watched her do it with an expression she had stopped finding surprising, and had started finding, in its own dry and economical way, something like warmth. They walked the filing to the succession court themselves, all of them, which was not how these things were typically done. Typically a representative filed. Typically the principals stayed behind the scenes. She had decided, somewhere between the East Wing room and the corridor, that she was done with behind the scenes. The court registrar was a small, precise man named Orveth, who had been doing his job for longer than most of the agreements he administered had existed, and who reacted to the arrival of Selene Vaelor, King Caedric Thorne of Ashenvale, and a formally bound succession filing before the 3rd hour by adjusting his spectacles and saying nothing for a full 10 seconds, which she suspected was the most extreme reaction available to him. He took the filing. He read the cover page. He read the emergency protection order request. He looked at Corvin's documentation of the Noble Council session. He said, "This will require the full panel." "I know," Selene said. "They convene at the 3rd hour. This is 40 minutes early." "I know," she said. "I'll wait." She waited. Caedric waited beside her. Corvin positioned himself in the corridor outside with the specific readiness of a man who expected the situation to attempt to complicate itself, and had decided to be between the complication and the room. At the 3rd hour, the court panel convened. 5 magistrates in the formal succession court chamber, elevated bench, the particular smell of old wood and older paper that she had been in rooms like this enough times to recognize as the smell of consequence. They took the filing. They reviewed the documentation in the specific methodical manner of people whose entire function depended on not being rushed, and who had clearly registered that being rushed was exactly what this morning intended. The Noble Council representative arrived at the 3rd hour and 15 minutes, which meant someone had warned them, which meant the council session leak was not as contained as she'd hoped. He was a junior functionary named Pell, who had the expression of a man who had been given instructions and was trying to execute them faster than the situation was moving. He was too late. The emergency protection order had been received and entered into the court record at the 3rd hour and 4 minutes. The 48-hour hold was active before Pell cleared the chamber door. She watched him understand this. She watched the specific moment of a man registering that the thing he was sent to prevent had already happened. It took approximately 3 seconds. Then he left, quickly, to report. She breathed. Caedric said nothing. He stood beside her in the succession court chamber with the filed documentation in the official record and the 48-hour hold active and the morning moving around them, and he said nothing because there was nothing that required saying. The court was in session. The claim was entered. The hold was in place. The Noble Council was going to come back harder. She knew this the same way she knew everything useful she'd learned in 5 years of political infrastructure work. Not through naivety about what powerful people did when their interests were threatened, but through the precise and unglamorous understanding that power when threatened does not retreat. It escalates. It looks for the weakest point in the opposing structure and presses there with everything available. She had 48 hours and one very strong point and several weak ones. The strong one was the documentation, the prior claim records, the irregularity report, the lapsed petition, Corvin's documentation of the pre-dawn council session. The weak ones were the practical realities of her position. No house behind her, no political allies of her own in Velmora court, no enforcement mechanism if someone decided to simply act in the territories regardless of what the court held. And she was operating from inside a palace where the majority of the people had aligned interests in seeing her fail. She thought about the Ashenvale embassy offices and what Caedric had offered, the diplomatic protection, the operational base. She had not said yes last night because she had been processing too many other things to make that decision cleanly. She made it now. She looked at him. "The embassy offices," she said. "Yes," he said. "We move there now." "Yes," he said, and turned, and they moved. The Noble Council's response came at the 6th hour, which was faster than she'd expected and more direct. They did not send a functionary this time. Elder Harwick arrived at the Ashenvale embassy offices personally. He was the senior council member, not the eldest, that was Voss, but the one who had held administrative authority over the council's operational decisions for 12 years, a man built like a deliberate architecture, everything load-bearing and nothing decorative. He had 3 council members with him, and a legal representative she recognized as one of the most expensive practitioners in Velmoran succession law. They were not there to negotiate. The legal representative's presence made that clear. Negotiation doesn't need that specific kind of expertise. They were there to find the structural fault and press it until something gave. She met them in the embassy receiving room. Caedric sat to her left. Corvin stood behind them. She had positioned herself at the center of the table deliberately, spine straight, hands visible on the table surface. The specific posture she had watched Caedric use when he wanted a room to understand that what was happening was not a conversation between equals in kind, only in formality. Harwick looked at her with the expression of a man assessing a problem he had underestimated and was recalibrating his approach to. She read it clearly. Good. Let him recalibrate. Recalibration cost time, and she needed time more than she needed anything else right now. "The protection order," Harwick said, is based on documentation of a council session that was a private administrative consultation, not a formal vote, not an action, a consultation. The statute defines prejudicial action as any coordinated effort by parties with material interest to affect the status of a disputed territory claim, she said. It does not specify formal vote. Coordination is sufficient. The documentation is incomplete, the legal representative said. He had a thin, precise voice and the manner of someone who had spent decades finding the exact edges of every legal framing. It shows presence at a session. It does not establish the content of the session or confirm that the content constituted coordination against your specific claim. She looked at Corvin. Corvin opened a folder and removed a single page and slid it across the table. The legal representative looked at it. His face did something extremely controlled and not quite successful. A transcript, she said, of the session content, provided by a source inside the council chamber who was present for the duration. She held Harwick's gaze. Your coordination is documented, Elder. The content is documented. The specific reference to Lord Cassin and the crown appointment timeline is documented. She paused one breath. The reference to ensuring the Vaelor claim does not survive the week is documented. Harwick was still. The kind of still that is not composure, but the result of several things happening simultaneously in a mind that is moving very fast and has not yet determined which of them to act on first. This is the thing about people who have operated with impunity for long enough. They stop accounting for the possibility of documentation. They have a conversation in a private session, and the privacy of it becomes, in their understanding, a fact of reality rather than a condition of circumstance. They forget that every room contains people, and people hear things, and some of them write it down. Marin Vaelor had written things down his entire career. She was his daughter in every way that mattered. What do you want? Harwick said. She held the question for exactly the right amount of time. Not too long, which would read as uncertainty. Not too short, which would read as rehearsed. A full investigation, she said. Properly resourced, properly independent. Not conducted by any authority with jurisdictional ties to the Dorne family or the Eastern Corridor. Administrative appointments. Timeline binding. Interim protection of the disputed territory's operational status pending outcome. She paused. And the Border Territories Authority inquiry records from 9 years ago. All of them, including the materials that were not included in the public-facing conclusion. Silence. Harwick looked at her for a long time. She looked back. She was aware of Caedric beside her with that absolute gravity of his, not intervening, not needing to. His presence was the structural fact that made the room what it was, the thing that meant Harwick could not simply dismiss her as a woman with a disputed claim and insufficient backing, because she had backing that was not insufficient. That was in fact the kind of backing that affected the calculation of every political actor in this region, whether they liked it or not. The inquiry records, Harwick said carefully, are sealed by administrative authority under the Border Territories jurisdiction. The Border Territories Authority's jurisdiction over those records lapses upon the filing of a formal investigation request that implicates the original inquiry's conclusion, she said, which I filed this morning as an addendum to the protection order. The legal representative made a sound that was not quite a word. You were thorough, Harwick said. He said it without inflection, which meant he was genuinely processing and had not yet found the performance mode to wrap around it. My father was thorough, she said. I learned from him. Something moved across Harwick's face at that. Not guilt. Men like Harwick had long since built internal architecture that deflected guilt before it could fully form. But something adjacent, the brief registration of a human cost that had been filed away under manageable, and now, in the light of the woman sitting across from him who was very clearly her father's daughter, was declining to stay filed. He stood. His council members stood. The legal representative collected his papers with the specific efficiency of a man who has been in losing positions before and has developed effective exit protocols. The council will consider the terms, Harwick said. You have 6 hours, she said, after which the protection order is renewed and the investigation request goes to the independent judiciary rather than staying in the succession court system, where I currently have more capacity to shape the process. He looked at her. She looked back. He left. The room exhaled. She sat in her chair for a moment and felt the specific physical reality of what the last hour had cost. Her hands were not entirely steady, which she noted with the detached interest of someone monitoring a piece of equipment under strain, and the space behind her sternum was doing something she had no polite clinical term for. a fast and slightly chaotic rhythm that had been building since the third hour and had not yet decided to resolve. This is what it costs to be the most dangerous person in a room. Not strength, not certainty, but the willingness to stay in the chair when everything in your nervous system is suggesting that the door is an option. Most people, at some point in a confrontation at this level, feel the pull of the door. The ones who change outcomes are the ones who feel it and don't move. She had not moved. Caedric said, "You're shaking." "I know," she said. "Good," he said. She looked at him. "People who don't shake are either disconnected from reality or have stopped processing it," he said. "Neither is useful." He slid a cup of water across the table to her. "Drink something." She drank something. It helped in the modest, material, irreplaceable way that basic physical acts help when the body is running too hot. Not enough, but enough. "They're going to come back with a counteroffer that's insufficient," she said. "Yes," he said. "And then we go to the full independent judiciary." "Yes," he said, "which takes this outside Velmoran court politics entirely." He paused. "It also takes it to a venue where Ashenvale has standing as an affected party. The border shared territories mean I can formally join the investigation as a co-interested sovereign." She looked at him. "That changes the weight distribution considerably." "Yes," he said, "it does." "Were you planning to tell me that before or after I needed it?" The almost not quite smile. "Before you needed it. You just moved faster than I expected." She turned the water cup in her hands. The tremor in her fingers was already less. Basic biology, she thought. The body calibrating down from peak activation when the immediate demand passed. She was grateful for basic biology. "Harwick's expression," she said. "When I mentioned the inquiry records, there's something in them." "Almost certainly," Caedric said. "Something beyond administrative misconduct." He was quiet for a moment. "Precise." "Corvin's source from the council session, the transcript you used, he heard more than what we put in the document." She looked at him. "What else?" "One of the council members in that session said something specific when Cassin's appointment was discussed. He said that the Vaelor situation had been managed once and could be managed again." He held her gaze. "He used the word managed in the context of your father's name." The water cup was very still in her hands. "Managed." The same word Draven had used when he described the territorial irregularity as something that had been handled. The same word the Empire apparently applied to inconvenient truths and the people who carried them. Her father had been managed, and now she was the inconvenient truth that needed managing. The fear that came with this was not dramatic or operatic. It was small and specific and cold, the fear of someone who has just understood that the people she is fighting are not constrained by the same rules she is operating under, that her filed documents and succession statutes and emergency protection orders exist inside a legal framework, and the people across the table have, at least once, operated outside it. She set the cup down. She looked at Caedric. I was already looking at her. He had not looked away since Harwick left, and the quality of his attention had shifted slightly. Not softer, Caedric did not do soft, but deeper. The full weight of a man who has faced threats that operated outside frameworks, and has made his own calculations about what that requires. "They're going to move against me directly," she said. "Possibly," he said. "Not legal. Not through the council or the court." "Possibly," he said again. "Your riders," she said. "How many do you have in Velmora?" 12 here, 40 more at the northern border way station. 2 hours hard ride." "Can you get them here without it reading as a military action?" He considered this with the particular precision of a man who has navigated the distinction between military presence and military action more times than was comfortable. "I can get them here as diplomatic security personnel, which is accurate, which also means they are here." He paused. "Say the word." She sat with it for 5 seconds. 5 seconds was enough. "Send for them," she said. He looked at Corvin. Corvin was already moving. The morning had turned into afternoon without her noticing the transition, the way time moves when you are operating at the pace of consequence rather than the pace of ordinary life. The light through the embassy windows had shifted from the low eastern angle of early morning to the higher, harder light of midday. And somewhere in the palace, the noble council was sitting with her terms and deciding what to do with them, and somewhere in the eastern corridor territories. The ground that bore her family's name was continuing to exist, regardless of what happened in rooms like this, the way land always does, patient, indifferent, simply there. She thought about her father riding back into the border territories for the final time. She thought about the careful handwriting on the petition that had lapsed before it could be heard. She thought about Elder Voss saying we acted on it anyway, and I honored her choice, and she thought about the specific courage of a man who tells the truth in an empire that is not structured to reward it. She thought about what it meant to be built from that. The word came from the corridor at 5:30, not through Corvin, but directly. A message delivered by one of Caedric's riders who handed it to him and stepped back. Caedric read it. He handed it to her without comment. It was not from Harwick. It was from Selene Vaelor. 4 lines. Her handwriting, which was decisive and slightly slanted, nothing like the elaborate court script that noble women were typically trained to produce. It said, I know what's in the inquiry records. My father kept a copy. He kept one because he knew that someday someone would come looking and he wanted something to hold. I have it. If you want it, come to the East Garden. Alone. Now. She read it twice. She looked at Caedric. No, he said. She has the inquiry records, she said. She says she has something, he said. Those are not the same thing. If she has a copy of what her father kept, Caedric, if there's documentation of what happened to my father beyond administrative misconduct, I know what it means, he said. I also know that the East Garden is separated from this building by 300 meters of open courtyard. No cover. 2 entry points that the palace guard controls, and is accessible from the Noble Council wing through a private corridor that doesn't show on the standard palace maps. She looked at him. You have the standard palace maps, she said. Corvin has everything, he said. The point is it's a controlled space, and she says alone. She's not Harwick, Selene said. She's not the council. She was standing in that hall last night with a document in shaking hands and an expression I recognized. Recognized how? He said. The same way I looked when I found out the ground under me wasn't what I'd been told it was, she said. She found out something in those documents that she wasn't ready for either. Caedric was quiet. This was a different quality of quiet from his usual, not processing, but the specific stillness of a man who has made a judgment and is deciding whether to say it. He said it. If you're right about her, going alone is still a significant risk, he said. If you're wrong about her, going alone is how this ends badly. I'm not going to get what she has through a representative, Selene said. This has to be me. Yes, he said, which is why I need you to listen to exactly what I tell you before you walk out that door. She looked at him. The full weight of his attention, the gray clarity of it, the gravity that didn't need to assert itself, all of it fully on her, and underneath it something she had been aware of since the second night of travel, and had been allowing to accumulate without naming, because naming it would make it real, and real things had weight, and she had been carrying enough weight. She named it now, privately, in the part of herself that was still the woman who had stood in a Ravengate flat, scrubbing copper bowls and trying to hold on to something ordinary. She named it, and it was real, and it had weight, and she was glad of the weight. Tell me, she said. He crossed the room and stood close enough that she could see the specific way the light hit the scar along his jaw, and he said 6 things in the precise and economical language of a man who means every word he uses and uses only the words he means. 6 things that were half tactical instruction and half something else entirely, and she listened to all of them. She repeated them back. He nodded once. She put her hand on the door. Selene, he said. She turned. He said, come back. Not a plea. Not a command. The specific register of a man who has survived everything thrown at him by not attaching too much to outcomes he can't control, who has built his entire governance on the understanding that certainty is a luxury the powerful cannot afford, saying something that was neither certain nor uncertain but simply, completely true. She said, yes. She walked out into the palace courtyard, into the hard midday light, across 300 meters of open ground toward the East Garden and whatever Selene Vaelor was waiting inside it to show her. The documentation that could either complete the case or be the mechanism by which the Noble Council ended her before she had a chance to build what she was building. The thing that hung between those two outcomes as thin and decisive as a blade edge. Behind her, the Ashen Vale embassy offices held the protection order and the filed claim and 40 riders still 2 hours out. Ahead of her, the East Garden gate stood open. She walked through it, and inside the garden, standing near the stone bench at its center, was not only Selene Vaelor. Beside Selene, with the expression of a man who had made a final choice between 2 versions of himself, was Elder Harwick. And in Harwick's hands was not a document. It was the seal of the Velmoran Emergency Council, the mechanism by which the Noble Council, in situations defined as threats to imperial stability, could invoke immediate territorial authority overriding all court filings, all protection orders, all succession statutes, bypassing the judiciary entirely. The seal that, once pressed, would erase everything she had built in the last 14 hours before the ink dried. She stopped. She looked at Harwick. She looked at Seraphine, whose face was doing something complicated and urgent and terrified that did not read like a trap and read very much like a warning. She looked at the seal. And she understood, with the complete and clarifying certainty of someone who has finally arrived at the place where there are no more positions to fall back to, that the next 30 seconds were going to determine everything, and that she had walked into them entirely alone. The East Garden in midday light was the kind of beautiful that didn't ask permission. Old stone benches worn smooth by decades of weather, a fountain that had stopped working sometime in the last century and now just held still water and sky, winter-stripped trees that were nevertheless present in the specific way of things that have survived enough seasons to stop being anxious about the next one. Selene stood inside the gate and looked at Harwick and the seal in his hands, and Seraphine beside him, and she breathed, and she thought. 30 seconds. She had identified 30 seconds as the decisive window before she walked out the embassy door. She had been wrong about the window. The window was right now, this moment, standing 12 feet from the emergency council seal, with no Caedric, no Corvin, no 40 riders, no legal filing that could move faster than an ink stamp. She looked at Seraphine's face first. This was not instinct. It was the specific methodology of someone who has learned to read rooms before reading individuals. And the room here was this garden, and the most important piece of information in this garden was not the seal, but the expression on the face of the woman who had sent the message that brought Selene here. What she found, terror. Not performed, not calculated, the specific physical register of genuine fear, visible in the set of Seraphine's jaw and the quality of her stillness, and the way her eyes had the particular brightness of someone who is containing something under considerable pressure. She was looking at Selene with an urgency that was trying to communicate something it could not say out loud. Selene read it. Then she looked at Harwick. He looked back at her with the expression she had expected. A man who had made a decision and was executing it, the flat and forward-facing composure of someone who has moved past the deliberation stage and is now simply in the action. The seal in his hands was the Velmoran Emergency Council mechanism, and it was real, and it could do what she understood it could do, and he knew she knew that. Lord Harwick, she said. Miss Vaelor, he said. He did not use her Luna title. He did not use the territorial claimant language she'd used in court. He used the bare social address of someone who has decided to define the terms of the room. That seal requires a council quorum to invoke, she said. 7 members minimum. I count 1. The quorum convened this morning, he said. The authorization was voted before you filed your protection order. The emergency invocation merely requires a senior member to execute in the field. He held the seal up slightly. Not a threat, just a demonstration. The gesture of someone showing you something they want you to understand is real. This was always the contingency, Miss Vaelor. You moved quickly. We moved first. She heard this and processed it, and set aside everything that was not immediately useful, which was the grief and the fear and the specific outrage of understanding that they had been 3 steps ahead of her since before she filed. That the council session Corvin had documented was itself possibly a performance designed to produce exactly the response she gave it, and that she had walked into a very well-constructed space. She set all of that aside and kept the one thing that was useful. Seraphine had sent her here. Seraphine standing beside Harwick, who was executing a plan that would erase Selene's claim and everyone connected to it, standing beside him with terror in her face and urgency in her eyes, and a message she had sent that said, I have something you need. Let her speak, Selene said to Harwick. Not a request. Harwick looked at Seraphine. Something passed between them that Selene read as a warning. The specific look of someone reminding another person which side of a line they're standing on. Seraphine said, My father kept records. Her voice was steady. It cost her something to make it steady, visible in the column of her throat and the set of her shoulders, but it was steady. Seraphine, Harwick said. He kept records of everything, Seraphine said, and she was not looking at Harwick now. She was looking at Selene with the full directness of someone who has decided something and is past the point of undeciding it. He was meticulous. He kept records of the Border Territories Authority inquiry. He kept the original field reports. He kept the correspondence. She paused. One breath. He kept the order. The garden was very quiet. What order? Selene said. Seraphine reached into the inner pocket of her coat. Harwick moved, not toward Selene, but toward Seraphine, a hand on her arm, not gentle. You do not want to do this, he said, and his voice had dropped into something below the register of the man who had sat across from Selene in the embassy receiving room, something that had less management in it and more of the thing that management was built on top of. Seraphine looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at his face. My father is dead, she said. He died 4 months ago, and I have been carrying what he left me for 4 months, wondering what it meant and what I was supposed to do with it. Her voice was still steady. And last night I stood in that hall with his document in my hands, and I looked at her and I understood what I was supposed to do with it. She pulled the document from her coat. Harwick's grip tightened. Seraphine said, If you take this from me, the copies go to the independent judiciary by courier and butts. She glanced toward the garden gate, and Selene tracked the glance and saw, just inside the wall, 2 figures she did not recognize who were very deliberately not looking at anyone. Approximately 4 minutes. Harwick's hand fell. Seraphine crossed the garden and handed the document to Selene. It was a single page. Old. The paper had the specific texture of something that had been handled many times and carefully preserved, and the ink was the particular faded black of writing that has sat in a protected archive for nearly a decade. At the top, the Border Territories Authority seal. In the body, a formal order, dated 9 years ago, authorizing what it called necessary resolution of the Vaelor assessor situation by whatever means the field authority deemed appropriate to ensure the security of the territorial agreement, whatever means. Signed by 3 names. 2 she recognized as council members who had since died. The third was Harwick's. She read it twice. She read the phrase whatever means 3 times, because language like that does not arrive in formal documents by accident. It arrives when the people writing it need the order to be legal and the method to be deniable, when they need the record to exist but the specifics to remain in the field, when they need to be able to say later that they authorized a resolution and could not have anticipated that the field authority would interpret it as they did. Her father had been managed. Here was the management, authorized in writing, signed by 3 hands, held for 9 years in a dead man's private archive, by a daughter who had not known what her inheritance actually contained until the night she stood in a ceremonial hall with an old document shaking in her hands. Selene looked up. Harwick was watching her read, with the expression of a man watching a wall. He built. Discovered the door he put in it. Not panicked, beyond panic. In the particular stillness that lives on the other side of panic, where the body has run out of alarm responses and is simply waiting to learn what comes next. She looked at him for a long time. This is what justice actually looks like when you strip away the ceremonial version. Not dramatic, not cathartic, not the reversal of a moment into its opposite. It looks like a piece of paper in an inherited coat pocket. It looks like a woman who has been living beside a truth without knowing its shape, finally handing it to the person it belongs to. It looks like standing in a winter garden with the document that answers the question you've been carrying for 9 years, and feeling not triumph, but something heavier and quieter, the weight of a grief that has finally found its correct name. Her father had not died in an accident. He had been ordered into one, by men who found his honesty inconvenient, by men who were still sitting at council tables making decisions about whose claims were valid and whose lives were manageable. She folded the document once and put it in her own coat pocket. She looked at Harwick. Put the seal down, she said. He looked at the seal. He looked at her. He looked at Seraphine, who was no longer trembling but was standing in the winter garden with the specific quality of someone who has put down something very heavy and is learning to breathe without the weight of it. He set the seal on the stone bench beside him. There is a moment, in confrontations between people who understand power, where the calculation completes and both parties register the outcome simultaneously, without the outcome needing to be stated. The calculation here was visible in real time. Harwick had the emergency seal, but Seraphine's copies were 4 minutes from the independent judiciary, which meant using the seal generated a document trail directly connected to a mechanism of suppression happening simultaneously with the surfacing of an assassination order bearing his signature, which was not a position that any legal infrastructure, however sympathetic, could protect him from. He had lost. He had known it the moment Seraphine handed the document across the garden. "You understand what this does," he said. Not to Selene, to the garden, to the morning, to the 9 years of managed truths that were now, finally, done being managed. "Yes," she said, "it does what my father's honest work was supposed to do 9 years ago." She held his gaze. "It tells the truth." Corvin was already moving when she came back through the embassy gate. She did not know how. She did not ask, because there were things about Corvin's operational methodology that she had decided were better appreciated than examined. But he had 2 riders positioned at the garden wall, and 3 more at the gate, and the document copies were already in motion toward the independent judiciary before she'd crossed the courtyard. Caedric was at the embassy door. He looked at her the way he had looked at her since the first morning in Grimset, completely, without filtering it through what he needed her to be. He took in her face and the coat pocket where the document sat, and the quality of her movement and whatever else he read from the aggregate of her, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. He stepped back to let her in. She sat in the receiving room and put the document on the table and looked at it. He sat across from her and also looked at it, not at her, giving her the room to be in the moment without being observed in it, which she understood by now was a form of respect so specific to him that she doubted he'd ever articulated it. She said, "It's signed." "I know," he said. Corvin read it before the copies went out. "Harwick's name is on it." "Yes. I was going to use the emergency seal," she said. "He had the quorum authorization from before I filed. He was going to erase everything." "Yes," Caedric said. Seraphine stopped him. He was quiet for a moment. "She sent you the message." She knew what her father's records contained. She'd had them for 4 months, and she'd been sitting with them, trying to determine what they meant. Selene looked at the document. She chose to hand them over, to me, knowing what it would cost her family's position. "It will cost considerably," Caedric said. "I know." She paused. "I'm not sure what to do with that." He considered this. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "She made a choice based on her own accounting. That's hers. You don't owe her a particular response simply because the choice benefited you." "But?" "But nothing," he said. "I'm not adding a but. I'm saying exactly what I mean." She looked at him. This is what it is, she thought, to be near someone who says exactly what they mean. It is simultaneously the most restful and the most demanding thing, because it requires you to do the same, and most people spend enormous energy maintaining the gap between what they mean and what they say. And living without that gap is both lighter and more exposed. She had not said exactly what she meant to anyone in 5 years. She said it now. "I'm grateful Seraphine did what she did," she said, "and I'm going to be angry about what that document contains for the rest of my life. And I'm going to carry my father's name into every room I enter from this point forward. And I intend to make sure that what was done to him is not simply a historical footnote in a succession court ruling." She held Caedric's gaze. "I want you to know that. All of it. Not the version I'd present to a court." He looked at her with the full weight of his attention and said, "I know." 2 words. Entirely sufficient. The independent judiciary took the document and the copies and the protection order filing and the succession statute invocation and produced, in the specific methodical manner of institutions that understand their own consequence, a formal investigation commission by the end of the same day. 3 independent commissioners. Timeline binding, no jurisdictional ties to the Border Territories Authority or the Eastern Corridor appointments. Harwick was suspended from council duties pending inquiry. 2 other council members with names on the morning session. Transcript requested voluntary compliance interviews, which the judiciary interpreted as the functional equivalent of an admission. The Vaelor territorial claim was entered as the primary subject of investigation, with Selene as the identified heir and claimant. The disputed territories were held under independent protection for the investigation's duration. It was not a victory. She was clear about that with herself, on the evening of that day when she sat in the embassy offices with the active investigation commission filed and Corvin's reports on the day's proceedings in front of her. A victory would have been her father riding home from the border territories 9 years ago. A victory would have been the irregularity report reaching the succession court directly instead of sitting in an archive. A victory would have been any one of the dozens of moments where an honest man's honest work might have been received by an empire structured to receive it, instead of managed by men who found honesty inconvenient. What this was justice of the available kind, not the kind that restores what was lost. Nothing restored her father. Nothing gave her back the 9 years of not knowing. Nothing. Unmade the 5 years she had spent at Draven's court without understanding what had positioned her there. The available kind of justice is the kind that stops the ongoing mechanism, that names the thing, that puts the correct information into the record where it can no longer be erased. It is smaller than what was owed and more important than nothing. And it is what survives when the gap between what was owed and what is possible has been honestly accounted for. She sat with this accounting and did not flinch from the gap. Draven came to the embassy offices that evening. He did not ask for an audience. He sent a message saying he was outside and she could receive him or not. She received him. He looked at her across the receiving room with the bare face she'd last seen in the alcove. No management, no position, just the man underneath the construction, which was, she now understood, a person of genuine intelligence and real capability who had built himself around a fundamental misunderstanding about what power required of him. He had believed that power required control. He had spent his life building control structures, political, relational, informational, and those structures had eventually controlled him, had made him the instrument of things he told himself he hadn't chosen and had nonetheless permitted. "The commission," he said. "Yes," she said. "Harwick." "Yes." He looked at the floor for a moment. Then, "The 2 council votes I held this morning, I've released them to support the investigation commission." He paused. "For whatever that's worth." She considered it. "It's worth something," she said honestly. He nodded. She looked at him, the man she had loved, which was real, and the man who had used her proximity as a shield, which was also real, and the man who had chosen a manageable alliance over a true thing because he was constitutionally better equipped to manage than to inhabit. And she felt the specific gravity of everything he was and everything he had cost, and she held it without resolving it into something simpler than it was. "I don't hate you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Not because you deserve the clarity, but because carrying hatred is expensive, and I have other things to spend the energy on." Something in his face moved. "And I don't forgive you," she said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way the word usually means. What was done to my father is not mine to forgive, and what was done to me, I'm still living inside it. Forgiveness, if it comes, will come later, and it will be something I arrive at for my own reasons, not as a courtesy to you." He said, "That's fair." "Yes," she said, "it is." He turned to go. At the door he stopped, which she had expected. It seemed to be his pattern, the things he needed to say, arriving at the threshold rather than the center of rooms. "She's going to break the engagement," he said. "Seraphine. She told me before I came here." He paused. "I thought you should know." Selene looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it, because whatever Seraphine Dorn was, she was also a woman who had handed over her inheritance to do the right thing, and the right thing had cost her the life she'd arranged for herself, and that was a real loss regardless of how complicated the arrangement had been. Draven looked briefly surprised, as if he had not expected sympathy from her direction. Then he nodded once more and left. She sat in the quiet of the receiving room and thought about the specific texture of loss that comes not from malice, but from everyone involved, making understandable choices in an empire structured to reward the wrong ones. Draven choosing manageable over true. Seraphine inheriting a secret without a manual for what to do with it. Elder Voss choosing silence because the truth was dangerous and he had already watched it kill one person he cared about. All of them navigating an architecture designed to make honesty prohibitively expensive, and all of them paying the prices anyway, differently in the end. She thought about her father riding back into the border territories for the final time. She thought about what he must have known, riding out, that he had filed a petition that named a truth that powerful people needed suppressed, that he had documented an irregularity in a report that the same powerful people would rather see disappear, that the authorization had likely already been given by the time he rode. She thought about whether he had known. She decided he had. She decided this because he was thorough and honest, and because thorough, honest people do not accidentally stumble into danger. They see it coming and assess the cost and continue anyway, because the alternative is to be the kind of person who sees and turns away, and some people simply cannot be that, regardless of what it costs. He had continued anyway. She was his daughter in every way that mattered. She continued anyway. So, Caedric found her on the eastern wall of the palace that night, which she had climbed to because she needed open air and height, and the specific perspective of being above the thing she was inside. She had not told anyone where she was going. He found her regardless, which she had stopped being surprised by. He climbed up and stood beside her and looked out at the Velmoran night, the city lights below, the dark mass of the eastern territories beyond the city boundary, the winter sky doing what winter skies did, clear and cold and enormous. They stood for a while without speaking. This is one of the rarest things available to human beings, to stand in significant silence with another person and have the silence be not empty but full, not uncomfortable but inhabited. Not the silence of having nothing to say, but the silence of two people who have said enough and are now simply being in the same place at the same time, which is its own complete thing. She broke it eventually, because she had something she needed to say while they were standing here with the night around them and the day behind them and the distance between what had been and what was coming visible from this elevation. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "In the garden," she said, "when Harwick set the seal down and Seraphine had given me the document, for a moment, one moment, I thought about what it would feel like to simply end it there. To take the document and the copies and go back to Ravengate and let the independent judiciary run the investigation without me being the named claimant, without being the one who has to fight for the next year or 2 years or however long this takes." She paused. "I thought about it for about 4 seconds. He said nothing, which was correct. And then I thought about my father," she said, "about what it cost him to continue when continuing was dangerous. And I thought that if I stop here, I make his cost smaller than it was. I make it something he paid for nothing, instead of something he paid towards something that eventually arrived." She looked out at the eastern territories in the dark. "I can't make his cost smaller than it was, so I have to be large enough to justify it." Caedric was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's not why you should do it." She looked at him. "Honoring the dead is real," he said, "but it's not the foundation you want to build on. Not for something this long. You'll run out of it eventually. The urgency of grief recedes, and if that's what's holding you up, when it recedes, you'll find yourself standing in the middle of a 2-year fight with nothing underneath you." He held her gaze in the night. "Do it because it's yours, because your name is on that claim, and your father's name is on that report, and you are the only person alive who can put both of those things into the record correctly. Do it because you're the right person for it, not because you owe it to someone who is gone." She looked at him for a long time. "Both things can be true," she said. "Yes," he said. "But only one of them will hold." She turned back to the eastern dark. She thought about what he was saying and found it true, and found it also harder than the grief version, because grief was a weight she knew how to carry, and this was something else, the requirement to want the thing for its own sake, to own the wanting without the shelter of obligation, to stand in the middle of a long fight on nothing but her own judgment that it was the right fight to be in. She stood there and owned it, the wanting, the judgment, the specific, unglamorous, necessary thing that leadership actually requires, which is not courage in the dramatic sense, but in the daily one, the willingness to continue, again tomorrow and the day after, not because you are certain of the outcome, but because you have assessed the cost and decided it is yours to pay. "Caedric," she said. "Yes." "What happens after the investigation concludes?" He considered it. "If the claim is confirmed, the territories revert to Vaelor governance. You would need to establish a functioning administrative structure, appoint oversight, build the political relationships necessary to maintain the claim against ongoing challenges." He paused. "It is a significant undertaking." "I know," she said. "I was asking about the other part." Silence. The kind of silence that is not empty. He said, "I will be in Ashenvale." "Yes," she said. "That's a long way from here." 3 days' ride, he said. "For most people. Less for someone with good horses and a reason." She felt something in her chest that was warm and specific, and had been accumulating since the second night of travel, when he'd said, "Uncertainty is the most expensive thing you carry," and she'd understood he was speaking from inside his own experience, not above it. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm not going to be someone's Luna again," she said. "Not as a position, not as an identity, not as the person beside the powerful person who enables the powerful person's power. If what is between us becomes something, I come into it as myself, as whatever I am after this is done, not as a function of you. He said, I know. You say that, she said. I need you to mean it. He turned to look at her fully. The scar along his jaw in the moonlight, the gray clarity of his eyes that was not warmth exactly, but was true in a way that warmth sometimes wasn't. I met you, he said, when you were negotiating your own terms in a border town way station before dawn. I agreed to escort you because the letter you sent me was written by someone who knew exactly what they wanted and was not apologizing for knowing it. Every decision you have made in the last 4 days has been yours. I have provided resources and positioning and stayed close enough to catch you if you fell, but I have not made a single choice on your behalf. He paused. What I want, going forward, is to continue being near someone who makes choices like that, not to be the reason for them, near them. His voice was even and unhurried and completely without performance. That is a different thing, and yes, I mean it. She looked at him. She thought about 5 years of being useful, of calibrating herself to what a room needed, what a man needed, what an empire needed. She thought about standing in the moon court beside banners she'd helped raise while the man she'd stood beside chose someone more manageable. And she thought about the cold flat in Ravengate and the copper bowls in the sink and the Tuesday morning she'd read a summons that should have destroyed her and decided instead to find a third option. She thought about what she was now, standing on the eastern wall of Black Hollow Palace with an investigation commission filed and a territorial claim active, and her father's order in her coat pocket, and the full, ungovernable, unchosen shape of her own life spread out ahead of her. She was not the Forsaken Luna anymore. She was not anyone's Luna. She was Selene Vaelor, the last of her name, with a claim in the court record and a fight she had chosen for her own reasons. And beside her was a man who had ridden 4 days to a border way station on the strength of an honest letter, and had not once, in everything that followed, tried to make her smaller than she was. 3 days' ride, she said. Less, he said, with good horses. She looked at the eastern dark where her family's land lay waiting. I'll have good horses, she said. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He just stood beside her on the wall in the winter night with the city below and the territories beyond and the whole of what was coming spread out ahead of them both. And he was simply, completely present in the way she had learned to trust. Not as rescue, not as shelter, not as the powerful person whose orbit defined her, but as a man standing solidly enough that choosing to remain near him was its own complete and voluntary thing. This is the thing that no one tells you about survival. It does not end with safety. Safety is not the destination. The destination, if there is one, is the moment you stop organizing your life around the wound and start organizing it around what you are when the wound is not the center of the frame. When you are not the person defined by what was done to you, but the person doing the next thing, the right thing, the thing that honors what it costs to still be standing. Selene Vaelor had been forsaken. She had been manipulated, positioned, betrayed in the small daily ways and the enormous geological ones. Had her father taken from her by men who found honesty inconvenient, had her name buried in a succession record for 11 years, had been asked to stand as prop and courtesy and gracious symbol in other people's stories. She had declined. She had found a third option, and a fourth, and a fifth, and she had built something out of every place she had been given nothing to build on. And she was still building, would continue building, would put her name on the record and her father's name on the record, and would sit across from council tables and judiciary panels, and whatever else the coming years required, and she would bring to every room what Marin Vaelor had brought to his, the specific, unglamorous, necessary, devastating gift of someone who tells the truth and continues anyway. The winter night was very cold and very clear. She breathed it in. Beside her, Caedric Thorne, King of Ashenvale, who had never once looked at her like a wound and had not stopped seeing her since the morning they sat across from each other in a border-way station with coffee going cold between them and an empire beginning to restructure itself around what she had chosen to become. He breathed it in too. And on the eastern wall of Black Hollow Palace, in the last hours of a day that had begun as one story and become another entirely, Selene Vaelor stood and felt, not happy. Happiness was too small and too fragile a word for it, but whole. Complete in the specific way of someone who has located all the pieces of themselves that were scattered by the breaking and has not glued them back into the old shape, but has arranged them into a new one that is more honest, if less comfortable, than what came before. She was not finished. The investigation would take months. The challenges would come. The men who had signed the order that killed her father were not all accounted for yet, and the empire was not suddenly or simply just because one document had reached the right hands. And there was a long and unglamorous and necessary road between the eastern wall of Black Hollow Palace and whatever governance of the Vaelor territories would eventually look like. She was not finished, but she was done being broken. She had survived beautifully, in the end, in front of all the people who had expected her destruction. And that was not a small thing. That was not a small thing at all.